I've always been someone who enjoyed camping alone. There's a certain peace that comes with being out in the wilderness by yourself. No distractions, no noise, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the brush. It's therapeutic in a way, or at least it used to be. This story takes place a couple of years ago when I decided to take a solo trip to a forest I had read about online. It was supposed to be less trafficked than the popular spots and had a reputation for being remote and untouched. Just what I was looking for. I packed my gear: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for colder weather, my trusty camping stove, and enough food and water for 3 days. I had all the essentials and I felt ready for the adventure. The drive to the trailhead took about 6 hours. The last hour was on a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense forest. I didn't pass a single car on the way, which made me feel like I was truly heading into the wilderness. By the time I arrived, it was mid-afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I parked my car in the small dirt lot, shouldered my backpack, and started hiking. The trail was everything I hoped it would be. It was narrow and overgrown in places, with ferns brushing against my legs and roots snaking across the path. The air was crisp and carried the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. I passed a few clearings that would have made decent campsites, but I wanted to get deeper into the forest before setting up for the night. My goal was to find a spot near a stream I had seen on the map, about 5 miles from the trailhead. I reached the stream about 2 hours later. It was a beautiful spot, with clear water trickling over smooth rocks and a flat area nearby that was perfect for pitching my tent. The forest was dense around the clearing, and I felt completely isolated. As I set up my tent, I noticed how quiet it was. Apart from the sound of the stream, there was an almost eerie stillness, but I chalked it up to being far from any human activity. This was exactly what I had wanted. After setting up camp, I cooked a simple meal on my stove and ate while watching the sun dip below the trees. Darkness fell quickly, and the temperature dropped with it. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and turned off my headlamp. The darkness was absolute. I could hear the stream nearby, its sound soothing as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost like a soft tapping or knocking. I lay still, trying to identify it. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon nosing around my campsite. But the sound didn't have the randomness of animal movement. It was deliberate, rhythmic. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. The sound stopped. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just the stream playing tricks on my ears and went back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the forest felt alive again. I made breakfast, packed a small day pack, and set off to explore the area. I spent the day hiking and taking in the beauty of the forest. I didn't see another person, which was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. By the time I returned to camp in the late afternoon, I was tired but satisfied. As I was gathering wood for a small fire, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints near my tent. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the edge of the stream and back again. They were boot prints, not animal tracks, and they looked recent. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints and trying to make sense of them. Had someone passed through while I was out hiking? If so, why hadn't I seen them? And why would they come so close to my camp without leaving a note or making themselves known? The rational part of my mind tried to calm me down. This was a public forest, after all. Maybe another hiker had wandered by and decided not to disturb my camp. But another part of me felt uneasy. The forest was so remote, and the trail so overgrown, that it didn't seem likely someone else would be out here. That night, I built a fire and sat by it, feeling more exposed than I ever had before. The light of the flames flickered against the trees, casting long, shifting shadows. I kept my flashlight and a small knife within arm's reach. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low and positioned my gear to block the entrance, as if that would somehow make me safer. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me sit up and listen. At some point during the night, I thought I heard the tapping sound again, but it was so faint and brief that I convinced myself I was imagining it. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When I emerged from my tent at first light, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of stones had been stacked near the entrance of my tent. They hadn't been there the night before. The arrangement was deliberate, almost like a marker or a warning. I stared at the stones, my mind racing. Someone had been at my camp while I was sleeping. I decided then and there that I wasn't staying another night. I quickly packed up my gear, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had felt so peaceful when I arrived, now seemed oppressive. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something, every rustle of leaves like it was caused by unseen eyes watching me. The hike back to the trailhead was tense. I kept a brisk pace, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. I thought I heard footsteps a few times, faint and distant, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. I didn't dare turn around. I just wanted to get to my car. When I finally reached the dirt lot, I felt a wave of relief. My car was right where I had left it. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The forest stood silent and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me leave. I've thought about that trip many times since it happened. I don't know who or what was out there, but I've never gone camping alone again. The wilderness, once a place of solace for me, now feels like a place where the line between safety and danger is far thinner than I ever realized. I had been planning the trip for weeks. After months of working long hours in the city, I wanted nothing more than to escape into the quiet of the wilderness. I packed everything carefully. My tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a sturdy backpack, and a map of the area. I decided to head to a remote spot about 2 hours from the nearest trailhead. It wasn't a marked campsite, but that was part of the appeal. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the road winding through dense forests and past scattered lakes. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was high in the sky, and I was eager to start the hike. I hoisted my backpack, adjusted the straps, and started walking. The trail was rugged, but manageable, weaving through tall pines and over rocky outcrops. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After about 2 hours, I reached the spot I'd marked on my map. It was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by trees. The stream's gentle babble was soothing, and the ground was soft enough for a comfortable night's sleep. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and organized my gear. With camp established, I sat on a flat rock by the stream and ate a late lunch, soaking in the tranquility. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I didn't stray too far from camp, just enough to get a sense of the surroundings. The forest was dense, with towering trees and a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. Occasionally, I'd spot animal tracks, deer, rabbits, maybe a fox. The thought of wildlife didn't bother me. I'd done enough research to know what to expect and how to handle most situations. As the day wore on, I noticed subtle signs that something was off. It started with the feeling of being watched. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar place, and it was natural to feel a bit uneasy. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the sense that eyes were following me. I'd pause and look around, scanning the trees for movement, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest. Back at camp, I tried to shake the feeling. I told myself it was just nerves and focused on preparing dinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and quieter. The only sounds were the crackle of my small campfire and the occasional rustle of leaves. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. I lay still, listening intently. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from the direction of my food stash. I'd hung my food bag high in a tree to keep it away from bears and other animals. But the noise didn't sound like an animal scavenging. It was too deliberate, too human. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding, straining to hear more. The rustling stopped, and for a long time there was silence. Then, just as I was starting to convince myself it had been nothing, I heard soft footsteps, crunching leaves, moving closer to my tent. I held my breath, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped just outside. I didn't dare move. Whoever or whatever was out there stood still for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I lay awake the rest of the night, gripping the handle of my pocket knife, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, I cautiously unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The campsite looked untouched, but when I checked my food stash, I saw that the rope had been cut and the bag was gone. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I'd come all this way, and I didn't want to let fear ruin the trip. I decided to stay, reasoning that it was probably just a curious hiker who hadn't realized someone else was camping there. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day staying close to camp, keeping my knife and bear spray within reach. That night, I made sure to keep my fire burning longer, hoping it would deter any unwanted visitors. I barely slept, every little noise outside jolting me awake. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that nothing else had happened. I told myself that I was being paranoid and resolved to enjoy my last day in the wilderness. I spent the day exploring again, this time venturing further from camp. The forest was beautiful, and for a while I forgot about my fears. But as the sun started to set, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. A series of small rock cairns, neatly stacked, lining the path back to my campsite. I hadn't seen them earlier in the day, and they hadn't been there when I first arrived. I hurried back to camp, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe another camper had passed through and decided to leave them as markers. But when I reached my tent, I found something that shattered that illusion. A single boot print, larger than my own, pressed into the dirt near the fire pit. It hadn't been there before. Panic set in. I quickly packed up my gear, not caring about organization. The sun was almost down, and I knew hiking out in the dark would be dangerous, but I couldn't stay another night. I grabbed my flashlight and started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could. The forest felt oppressive, the shadows deep and the air heavy. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. About an hour into the hike, I realized I wasn't on the main trail. In my haste, I'd veered onto a side path. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I stopped, trying to get my bearings, but the forest looked the same in every direction. My flashlight beam seemed pitifully small against the vast darkness. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a landmark or some indication of the main trail. The path I was on was narrow and overgrown, branches snagging at my clothes and backpack. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. I kept glancing behind me, but all I saw was darkness. Then up ahead, I saw a faint light. My first thought was relief. Maybe it was another camper or someone who could help me find my way back. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't coming from a campfire or flashlight. It was a small lantern, hanging from a tree, swaying gently in the breeze. Beneath it, the ground was littered with more rock cairns, each one larger than the ones I'd seen earlier. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But before I could move, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness beyond the lantern. I didn't wait to see who or what was making them. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise or the direction. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally stopped, I was in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. My flashlight was flickering, and I realized the batteries were dying. Desperation set in. I fumbled for my map, but without proper light, it was useless. I decided to stay put until dawn, reasoning that it would be safer than wandering aimlessly in the dark. I found a spot against a large tree where I could see in all directions and sat with my back to it, gripping my knife tightly. The night was long and terrifying. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I got up, stiff and sore, and started walking in what I hoped was the direction of the trailhead. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled onto the main trail. The sight of it almost brought me to tears. I reached my car just as the sun was reaching its peak. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something I couldn't fully understand. I don't know who or what was out there in the forest with me, but I've never gone camping alone again. Some places are better left undisturbed. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by trees and the sound of nature, that makes you feel truly alive. This story, though, isn't about a love for the outdoors. It's about the time I wished I had stayed home. Last summer, I decided to spend a weekend camping alone. I'd done it before, and while most people thought it was reckless, I found it freeing. The plan was simple. Drive out to a remote spot in the national forest, hike a few miles to a secluded area, and spend 2 nights under the stars. I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and a reliable map, and left early Saturday morning. The drive to the trailhead took about 3 hours. By the time I arrived, the sun was high in the sky, casting dappled light through the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the faint rustle of leaves made me feel miles away from civilization. After parking my car, I hoisted my backpack and started hiking. The trail was well marked at first, winding through dense forest and over small streams. I passed a few other hikers along the way, exchanging polite nods and smiles, but as I ventured deeper into the forest, the trail became less defined. This was exactly what I'd wanted: solitude and quiet. By early afternoon, I found a clearing near a small creek that seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I spent the rest of the day gathering firewood, setting up my tent, and preparing a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small fire and sat by it, enjoying the cool evening air. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle burble of the creek. It was peaceful, and I felt completely at ease. That first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, waking only briefly to the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. The next morning, I cooked breakfast over the fire and planned to spend the day exploring the area. With my map in hand, I ventured deeper into the forest, following the creek upstream. The day was uneventful at first. I found a few interesting rock formations and stumbled upon a small waterfall that wasn't marked on the map. It was the kind of discovery that made trips like this worthwhile. By mid-afternoon, though, I realized I had wandered farther than I'd intended. The sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky, and the dense forest made it feel later than it actually was. I decided to head back to camp. Retracing my steps should have been simple. I'd followed the creek upstream, so all I had to do was follow it downstream. But somehow, things didn't line up. I'd pass landmarks I didn't recognize or find myself in areas that didn't match my map. The forest, which had felt welcoming in the morning, now seemed oppressive. Every tree looked the same, and the creek's meandering path only added to my confusion. By the time I finally stumbled back into my campsite, it was nearly dark. My relief at finding the familiar clearing was short-lived, though. Something felt off. My tent was still there, as was my fire pit, but the area looked disturbed. The firewood I'd gathered was scattered, and the small stack of supplies I'd left outside the tent had been knocked over. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into my things, but nothing was torn or eaten. It was as if someone had rummaged through my belongings and then left everything in disarray. I told myself it was probably a curious raccoon or maybe a fox. Still, the thought of someone else being out here, messing with my stuff, put me on edge. I decided to skip the fire that night and eat a cold dinner inside my tent. As I lay in my sleeping bag, the forest felt unnervingly silent. The usual nocturnal sounds were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made it hard to relax. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to a faint sound outside the tent. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the scamper of a small animal. It was deliberate. Footsteps. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The steps were slow and measured, circling the tent. Whoever it was, and I was sure now it was a person, they weren't in a hurry. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the steps moved away. I waited for what felt like an eternity before unzipping the tent slightly and peeking outside. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, but there was no sign of anyone. I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I decided to cut the trip short. The peaceful solitude I'd sought was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to the trailhead. The forest, which had felt so inviting just a day ago, now seemed full of shadows and unseen eyes. About an hour into my hike, I found something that made my blood run cold. A tree near the trail had been marked with deep, deliberate scratches, and beneath it, the ground was littered with small bones. They looked like they belonged to birds or small mammals, but the arrangement seemed intentional. I took a wide detour around the area and quickened my pace. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. By the time I reached my car, my legs were trembling, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I tossed my gear into the back seat and drove away without looking back. It's been months since that trip, and I still think about it often. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was another camper who stumbled upon my site, or perhaps my imagination got the better of me, but no explanation feels entirely satisfying. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. I've always loved camping. It's the stillness of the woods, the quiet you can never find in a city, and the way the stars feel so much closer when you're far away from everything. But one trip changed how I see the wilderness, and I haven't been able to forget it. It was late September, and I decided to spend the weekend at a remote camping spot deep in the forest. This wasn't a public campground with marked trails and other campers nearby. This was the kind of place you only find if you've spent years poring over maps, looking for spots far away from the beaten path. I'd found it a few years ago, nestled between two ridges with a small stream running through. It was perfect, isolated, peaceful, and untouched. I left early in the morning, hoping to make it there by midday. The drive took me through winding mountain roads and small towns where time seemed to stand still. By the time I reached the trailhead, the air had a crispness that hinted at the coming winter. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and some basic tools and started the hike. The trail was overgrown, barely more than a deer path in some places. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots, and the only sounds were the rustle of the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I reached the spot. It was just as I remembered. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with the stream cutting through the middle. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating patterns on the forest floor. I set up my tent near the stream, unpacked my gear, and settled in. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon collecting firewood, setting up a small fire, and cooking dinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I wrapped myself in a jacket and sat by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the symphony of the forest. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep almost immediately. The first night was peaceful. I woke up early, made coffee over the fire, and spent the morning exploring the area. The forest was dense, and I had to be careful not to lose my bearings. I marked trees with small cuts and used my compass to keep track of my direction. By midday, I was back at camp, tired but content. I spent the afternoon reading and relaxing by the stream. It was the second night when things started to feel off. The evening began like the first. I cooked dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the stars come out. But as the night grew darker, I felt a growing sense of unease. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something wasn't right. The forest seemed quieter than before. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, double-checked my gear, and crawled into my tent. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent, listening to the silence outside. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The tent was dark, and everything was silent. I strained my ears, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I froze, too scared to move. Whatever it was large. I could hear it breathing, slow and steady. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. A bear? A deer? But something about the sound didn't match either. It was too deliberate, too aware. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound moved away. The rustling grew fainter until it disappeared altogether. I lay there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside, there was no sign of anything unusual. The ground around my tent was undisturbed, and the forest seemed normal again. But the unease lingered. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I hiked to a nearby ridge, hoping the exercise and the view would calm my nerves. The scenery was breathtaking, endless miles of forest stretching to the horizon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low in the sky, and I was exhausted. That night, I built the largest fire I could manage. The flames cast long shadows, flickering against the trees. I stayed up late, feeding the fire and trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone out there. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the darkness, but the beam of light only illuminated the nearest trees. The rest of the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. The rustling grew louder, circling the camp. Whatever it was moving deliberately, testing me. I shouted into the darkness, hoping to scare it off. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the edge of the firelight, I saw movement. A figure, human-shaped but too large, too strange, stepped into the light for just a moment before retreating into the shadows. My blood ran cold. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning until the first light of dawn, constantly scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. When morning came, I packed my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to the trailhead. The sense of being watched never left me. Every snap of a twig, every shadow, felt like a threat. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, not stopping until I reached my car. As I drove away, the tension slowly began to fade, replaced by a deep exhaustion. I told myself I'd imagined most of it, that my mind had played tricks on me. But even now, years later, I can still hear that sound, still feel that presence. I haven't been camping since. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's not ours. It belongs to something older, something that doesn't take kindly to intruders. I learned that the hard way, and while I'll always miss the peace of the forest, I know I'll never set foot in those woods again. It started as a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway to escape the stress of work and the city. I had picked a spot deep in the woods of Vermont, a state I've always loved for its endless greenery and quiet solitude. The area wasn't far from where I grew up, so it felt familiar, even though I had never camped at this particular site before. I planned everything carefully. A lightweight tent, enough food and water for 2 days, and all the basic survival gear. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat, just me and nature. The drive out was uneventful. The small dirt road leading to the trailhead was surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. I parked my car at the designated lot, where a few other vehicles were already parked, suggesting I wouldn't be entirely alone in the area. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, double-checked the map, and set off down the trail. The hike to my campsite was about 5 miles, winding through dense forest. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my boots. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle of squirrels in the brush kept the forest alive with sound. After about 2 hours of walking, I found the clearing I had marked on my map. It was perfect, flat ground, a view of a small, serene lake, and enough open space to set up camp comfortably. I pitched my tent near the tree line, giving myself a bit of shade and some cover. The lake sparkled under the late afternoon sun, and the air was so still that it felt like time had stopped. After setting up camp, I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area, careful not to stray too far. I built a small fire pit with rocks and started a fire to cook my dinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I ate in silence, enjoying the peace that only nature can provide. By the time darkness fell, the forest was eerily quiet. The occasional hoot of an owl or the distant cry of a coyote was all that broke the stillness. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, and thought about how rare it was to find moments like this. Eventually, the fire burned low, and I decided it was time to sleep. I extinguished the flames, zipped myself into my tent, and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, unsure of what had disturbed me. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, the way the forest seemed to breathe with its own life. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching of leaves. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal, but something deliberate, like footsteps. My heart began to race. I lay still, straining to hear more. The sound grew closer, moving in a slow, measured way around my campsite. It could have been another camper, I told myself, but the lack of light or voices made that unlikely. Whoever it was didn't announce themselves, and that alone was unsettling. I reached for the knife I kept in my bag, gripping it tightly. The footsteps paused, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they retreated, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for hours listening, but the sounds didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and surveyed the area. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as I moved toward the edge of the clearing, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed. Footprints, clearly human, circled my campsite. They weren't mine. I had been careful to set up camp without wandering too much. The prints were fresh, and they led back into the woods. A chill ran down my spine. I debated whether to pack up and leave, but convinced myself to stay. Maybe it was just a hunter or another camper passing through, I reasoned. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent the day hiking around the lake, trying to enjoy the beauty of the wilderness, but I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. That evening, I built another fire and cooked dinner, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. As night fell, the same oppressive silence returned. I decided to stay up later, keeping the fire going as long as possible. The light and warmth made me feel safer, though I couldn't ignore the gnawing anxiety in my gut. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunching of leaves, closer this time. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I aimed the beam of light toward the sound but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the forest went quiet again. I called out, but there was no response. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crackle of the fire. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, clutching the knife, my eyes darting toward every shadow. At one point, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but it was too dark to be sure. The hours crawled by until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. When morning came, I made the decision to leave. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just a day ago, now felt menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every sound, a snapping twig, a rustling branch, set my nerves on edge. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car untouched. I threw my gear into the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible among the shadows, was a figure. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching as I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I kept driving until I was miles away from the woods. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just a curious hiker, but their silence and the way they lingered felt wrong. I haven't been camping alone since. The woods, once a place of solace and peace, now hold an edge of fear I can't quite shake. That weekend was supposed to be an escape, but instead, it became a reminder of how vulnerable we are when we're alone in the wild. Camping has always been my way of escaping the grind of everyday life. Living in the city can wear you down. The noise, the crowds, the endless rush to be somewhere. So when I had a rare weekend off, I decided to head out to a remote area of the forest, a place I'd read about online. It was supposed to be peaceful, untouched, and far from the usual trails. Just what I needed. The drive out there took longer than I'd expected. The last stretch was on a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. It felt like entering another world. By the time I reached the spot I'd marked on my map, it was late afternoon. I parked the car, grabbed my gear, and set off into the woods. The hike to the campsite was about 2 miles. The trail was faint, more like an animal path than something meant for people. It wound through dense trees and overgrown underbrush. I had to stop several times to check my bearings. My GPS worked sporadically, and I'd occasionally lose the signal under the thick canopy. Still, I eventually found the clearing I'd been looking for. A small patch of flat ground near a quiet stream. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and made myself a quick meal. The stream provided clean, cold water, and the sound of it was soothing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of insects and distant animal calls. It was exactly the kind of solitude I'd been craving. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and letting my mind wander. When the fire started to die down, I climbed into my tent and fell asleep almost immediately. The forest was so quiet that I didn't even need earplugs, which was rare for me. The only sound was the gentle burble of the stream. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream deeper into the woods. I found a few animal tracks, some interesting plants, and even a small waterfall. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I loved being outdoors. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already setting. As I prepared dinner, I noticed something odd. The clearing felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the atmosphere had changed. It was subtle, like the way the air feels just before a storm. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired from the hike. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest seemed louder than before. The usual background noise of crickets and frogs was punctuated by occasional rustling in the underbrush. I'd hear something, sit up and listen, but it would stop as soon as I focused on it. It's probably just animals, I told myself, but my unease grew. Around midnight, I heard a distinct snapping sound, like a branch breaking. It was close. I froze, straining to hear more. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Shining the light around, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to pack up and move to a different spot. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I didn't want to spend another night feeling on edge. I found another clearing about half a mile upstream. It wasn't as nice as the first one, but it would do. I set up camp again and spent the day trying to relax. By evening, I felt a bit better, but that night, the unease returned. The sounds were back, louder this time. Rustling, snapping, even what sounded like faint footsteps. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, but deep down, I didn't believe it. I stayed awake for hours, clutching my flashlight and listening. Around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. I stepped out of the tent and immediately noticed something was off. The fire pit I'd built the evening before was scattered. The stones were pushed aside, and the ashes were spread across the ground. It wasn't the wind, it looked deliberate. My gut told me to leave, but I hesitated. I didn't want to abandon the trip over something that could have been a curious animal. I decided to stay one more night, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day close to camp, gathering more firewood and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. As the sun set, I made a larger fire than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. That night was the worst. The sounds started almost as soon as it got dark. Heavy footsteps, moving deliberately through the trees. They would stop and start, always just out of sight. My flashlight revealed nothing but darkness and shifting shadows. The fire crackled loudly, but it didn't feel like enough to keep the unknown at bay. Around midnight, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. A low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a moan. It was close, maybe 20 feet away. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the largest stick from the fire and held it like a torch. The noise stopped, but I could feel something watching me. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the burning stick and scanning the darkness. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I was back in my car, speeding down that narrow dirt road. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just an animal, something curious or territorial. Or maybe it was another person, someone who didn't want me in their woods. Whatever it was, it made it clear that I wasn't welcome. That trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into a reminder of how small and vulnerable we are in the wilderness. I haven't been back to that forest since. I still go camping, but I stick to well-traveled areas now. As much as I love solitude, I've learned that there's a fine line between peace and isolation, and sometimes it's better not to cross it. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the great outdoors. The kind of weekend where you could forget about everything, work, life, all the stress, and just breathe in the fresh air. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was just the fact that I had decided to go alone. The plan was simple. Set up camp in a secluded area by a lake, far away from the trails and the crowds. I'd have the place to myself, just me, my tent, a campfire, and the sounds of nature. I'd been hiking for about 5 miles that morning, a steady climb, the ground getting rockier as I went. By the time I arrived at the lake, I was tired but excited. It was the kind of remote place that felt untouched, the kind of place you read about in outdoor magazines, the ones that promise peace and solitude. I found the perfect spot by the water's edge, just far enough from the trees to avoid too much shade, but close enough to enjoy the view of the lake. I unpacked my gear and set up my tent. As I did, the wind picked up a little, rustling the trees in the distance, but it wasn't anything unusual. I shrugged it off and got the fire going. The crackling flames were soothing, and I sat back to enjoy the feeling of being alone, far from the noise of civilization. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature dropped quickly as evening settled in, but I was prepared. I had enough food, water, and layers to keep warm. The sky above me was clear, the stars starting to peek through, one by one, like tiny pinpricks of light. There was no moon yet, and the night air was still. But then, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the wind, a slight noise in the distance. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but it felt off. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the fact that I was so far from anyone else. The only sounds I could hear were the wind, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional ripple on the lake. But every now and then, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps, soft but distinct, moving through the brush. At first, I figured it was an animal. It's common to hear things rustling in the night, especially in the woods. But the more I listened, the more it didn't feel right. I stood up and scanned the area around me. The trees were thick, and beyond the firelight, it was hard to make anything out. My heart rate picked up a little, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon. I told myself that's all it could be, but then I heard it again. The steps, this time they were closer. My skin prickled as I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to alert whatever was out there. My breath became shallow as I waited, listening. The air was still, but I could hear the faint sound of something moving through the underbrush. Slowly, deliberately, like it was trying to remain hidden. I considered packing up and leaving. The thought crossed my mind, but it was already dark, and the hike back would be dangerous without a proper light source. Plus, I didn't want to seem paranoid. I'd be fine. I had a knife in my bag, and I was in a well-established area. No reason to panic yet. But then I saw movement. A shadow shifted just outside the range of my campfire's glow. It wasn't an animal, at least not one that I recognized. It was too big, too human-like. My pulse quickened, and I turned the flashlight on, swinging it toward the shadow. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the shadow had vanished. My hands were shaking as I held the flashlight, scanning the area. My thoughts were racing. Who could be out here? I hadn't seen anyone on the trail earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and that feeling gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing second. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, constantly on edge, listening to every sound. My eyes never left the shadows, and I was too scared to get into my tent. Whatever was out there, whatever I had seen, had me feeling exposed. The wind howled through the trees, and I told myself it was just the weather, just the normal sounds of the woods. But every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent me into a heightened state of alert. At one point, I even thought I saw eyes, faint reflections of light, but I couldn't be sure. They disappeared as quickly as they appeared. By morning, I was exhausted. The sun had risen, and the first light of day felt like a relief. The air was still cool, but it didn't feel as threatening anymore. I packed up my gear slowly, trying to gather my thoughts. I had no idea who or what had been watching me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I wanted to leave, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me after too much solitude. I decided to hike out, but the uneasy feeling never really left. The hike down was quiet, and as I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out of the trees at any moment. I didn't encounter anyone on the trail, and the further I got from the campsite, the more the sense of dread seemed to fade. When I reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see my car. The familiar sight of it made everything feel normal again. But as I drove away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was impossible to make out details, but the figure was tall, standing still, just watching me. My heart raced, but when I turned around to look, there was nothing. The road was empty. I didn't go back to that spot for a long time, and whenever I thought about that trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there with me that night. The shadows, the footsteps, the figure in the woods. I don't know what it was, but I've never been so unsettled in my life. It was a reminder that sometimes, in the wilderness, we are never as alone as we think. But I was safe. I got out, and that's what matters most. I never thought a camping trip would turn out to be the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It was supposed to be a simple solo adventure to clear my head, spend a few days in nature, and enjoy the quiet. I had chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any main trails, and set up my camp without anyone nearby for miles. Just me, the trees, and the mountains. But nothing about it went according to plan. It started out perfectly. I had packed all my gear the day before. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few extra things like a flashlight, a lighter, and a knife. The weather was warm, and the sky was clear when I arrived at the site. There was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The perfect place to pitch a tent and get away from everything. I spent the first hour setting up, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in a long time. The birds were chirping, and the breeze rustled the leaves. It was peaceful. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going, and I sat there watching the flames dance, cooking a simple meal. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. There wasn't a sound except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind. It was beautiful in a way that made you forget about everything else. I hadn't realized how much I missed being out here, away from the noise of daily life. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, and the fire's warmth became more inviting. I had finished eating and was sitting back, enjoying the stars overhead. That's when the first strange thing happened. I heard a sound, a low thud, like something heavy had fallen in the woods. I stood up, trying to locate the source, but the darkness swallowed everything past the edge of the firelight. I was alone, or so I thought. I shook my head. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Deer, maybe, or a bear, though I didn't think there were bears around here. Still, the sound was enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the area, but there was nothing, just trees and bushes. I sat back down, trying to ignore the knot of tension that was slowly tightening in my stomach. The hours went by, and the fire flickered down to a few embers. I threw another log on to keep it going. The night was silent again, but that silence felt different now. It was oppressive, as if the woods were watching me. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the fire and the occasional crackle of the wood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At some point, I decided it was time to go to bed. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to get some sleep. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. My mind kept racing, replaying the sounds I'd heard earlier. The thud, the way the wind had shifted, the growing sense that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, I finally drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. Every little noise made me jerk awake, heart pounding in my chest. The wind outside the tent seemed louder than before, rustling the branches with an eerie intensity. I was tangled in my sleeping bag, half awake and half asleep, when I heard it again. Thud. It was louder this time, closer. Something was moving outside my tent. The unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting on the ground. My heart rate skyrocketed, and I froze. My mind raced. Was it a bear? Person? Something else? I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. If I was quiet enough, maybe whatever it was would leave. But it didn't. The thud came again. Closer. I slowly reached for the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for it. I was terrified to shine it outside, but I had to know what was out there. My heart was in my throat as I crept closer to the tent's wall and pressed the button. The beam of light pierced the darkness, cutting through the night air like a knife. There was nothing, no bear, no person, just the trees swaying in the wind. My breath was shallow, but my mind wasn't at ease. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the wall of the tent, too scared to fall asleep, too scared to move. The next morning, I woke up late. The sun was already high in the sky, and the temperature had risen with it. I sat up slowly, my eyes heavy, but at least the terror of the night seemed to fade. I told myself it had just been the wind, the trees. It had to be. It was normal to be a little jumpy out here, right? But when I stepped outside, the unease returned. There were fresh tracks around the campsite, large, deep impressions in the dirt where something heavy had walked. They circled my tent, almost as if they had been watching me. I crouched down, examining the prints. They were too large to be a deer or any animal I knew of. They looked like boots, heavy boots, My heart sank. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching me. I grabbed my knife, and for the first time, I felt the weight of it in my hand. I wasn't alone, and that thought made the forest feel suffocating. My mind raced as I scanned the woods around me. I couldn't see anything. No signs of life. But someone had been here, someone who wasn't supposed to be. I decided it was time to leave. Packing up my gear took longer than I expected. My hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my bag. I was being careful, trying not to make a sound. I didn't know if whoever it was had left or if they were still out there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Just as I finished packing up my things, I heard something again, a twig snapping off to the side. Then another, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in the clearing, the woods closing in on me. Whoever was out there, they were getting closer. And then I saw it, a figure moving through the trees, just on the edge of my vision. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see enough to know it was a person. They were coming toward me. Panic surged through me, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly afraid of the woods. This wasn't a bear or an animal. This was something worse. This was a person, someone who was out here for a reason I didn't want to know. I grabbed my gear, half dragging it, half carrying it, and sprinted in the opposite direction. My legs burned as I pushed through the thick underbrush, the trees seeming to close in around me. Every noise made me stop. Every crack of a branch set my heart racing. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but that only made me more paranoid. Was I being followed? I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running, forcing myself to move through the pain, through the exhaustion, through the fear. I had no plan, no map, just an instinct to get out of the woods as fast as I could. It was hours before I made it back to the main trail, and when I finally emerged, the sight of the open space, the road, felt like a relief so strong I nearly collapsed. I didn't turn around. I didn't look back. All I knew was I needed to leave. I needed to get home. The rest of the hike was uneventful, and when I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I drove away without a second thought, my mind still racing with the events of the night. As I drove out of the woods, I thought about the tracks, the boots, and the figure I had seen. Whoever it was had been watching me, but they hadn't followed me out. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, or maybe they had something else in mind. I would never know, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never going camping alone again. I had always been the kind of person who loved the outdoors. Growing up in Vermont, I spent countless days hiking, fishing, and camping in the woods. The quiet of nature had a way of calming me, the fresh air filling my lungs and making me feel more alive than any city ever could. So, when the opportunity came for a weekend camping trip with a couple of friends, I didn't hesitate. We picked a remote spot in the mountains, far from civilization, a place I had heard about from locals but had never been to myself. It was supposed to be peaceful, a weekend to disconnect and enjoy the beauty of nature. But nothing could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the rugged landscape. The forest was dense here, trees thick and close together, their trunks wrapped in thick moss. The air smelled rich with pine, earthy and fresh, and the distant sound of a rushing stream could be heard faintly. Our campsite was at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering pines, with just enough room to set up our tents. My friends, eager to start the fire, began gathering wood, while I took a moment to admire the view. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and I zipped up my jacket, pulling the collar tight around my neck. The fire crackled, its orange flames dancing in the cool evening air. We ate, talked, and laughed, the firelight flickering on our faces, casting long shadows around the clearing. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't the dark or the wild sounds of the forest, but something else. A feeling that was hard to shake. A nagging sense that we weren't entirely alone. After dinner, we sat around the fire for a while longer, but eventually we all grew tired. The cold was beginning to settle in, and the warmth of the fire wasn't enough to keep it at bay. I said goodnight and crawled into my tent, curling up in my sleeping bag and trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had followed me all evening. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The usual chorus of crickets and owls was absent, replaced by a silence so complete that it felt almost unnatural. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable, but the feeling only grew stronger. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the canvas of my tent, listening intently. The only sound was the occasional crack of wood from the dying fire outside. But then, in the distance, I heard something else. It was faint at first, a rustling noise, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the sound was deliberate, too rhythmic, too close to the camp. It stopped. Then, moments later, I heard it again, this time much closer. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound continued, drawing closer. Footsteps, but they weren't the quick, light steps of an animal. They were slow and heavy, like someone was deliberately trying to sneak around the camp. Panic began to set in, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't sure what to do. I could hear my friends snoring in their tents nearby, unaware of whatever was out there. I slowly unzipped the tent just a little, enough to peek out. The campfire was almost out, just a pile of glowing embers casting faint light around the clearing. The trees around us were dark, but I could see movement, shadows shifting in the distance. I felt a surge of adrenaline. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there, and it was close. I silently zipped the tent back up, my heart racing. The footsteps had stopped. I lay there, straining to hear, but the silence returned. It was unbearable. I wanted to get up and warn my friends, but I didn't want to risk making any noise. So I lay there, frozen, listening, waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time seemed to slow down in that tense, quiet space. But then, something else happened, something worse. The sound of footsteps returned, but now it wasn't just one pair of footsteps. It was multiple, soft, heavy, deliberate, moving around the campsite. I could hear them moving from one side to the other, circling, as if they were trying to figure out the best way to approach. My heart was pounding now, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Whoever or whatever was out there was watching us. It was like they knew we were here, and they were waiting for the right moment. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, trying to control my panic. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I listened for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the next movement. But nothing. I waited. Still nothing. I couldn't stay in the tent anymore. I had to check on my friends. I slowly unzipped the tent again, this time more carefully, and peeked out. The campsite was quiet, the fire now just a few embers, casting a dim glow. I glanced over to the other tents. My friends were still inside, completely unaware of the danger. But I noticed something strange. There was an imprint in the dirt, a set of footprints, heavy and deliberate, just outside my tent. They were too big to be animal tracks. Human. I didn't wait any longer. I crawled out of the tent as quietly as I could, grabbing my flashlight and shining it around the campsite. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the clearing, but I saw nothing. The air was still, too still. I quickly woke my friends, shaking them awake and telling them in a low voice to stay quiet. They didn't understand at first, but when they saw the tracks near my tent, they got it. I could see the fear in their eyes now. We all knew something wasn't right. We didn't know who or what was out there, but we knew we were being watched. We gathered our things quickly and silently, trying not to make any noise. We decided to pack up and leave the campsite. It wasn't safe anymore. We had to get out of there. As we moved through the trees, the air felt thick with tension, and every rustling sound made us freeze. We kept moving, heading toward the trailhead that would lead us back to our cars. We didn't know if we were being followed, but we didn't care. We just needed to get out. By the time we reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the trees. We didn't stop to look back. We kept walking faster now until we finally reached our cars. It wasn't until we were safely in our vehicles, driving down the mountain, that we allowed ourselves to breathe again. The whole experience felt like a bad dream, but it wasn't a dream. It was real. We never found out who or what was out there, but I don't think we ever needed to know. The truth is, we were lucky to get out when we did. We never went back to that spot again. Sometimes, I think about that night when I'm alone in the woods, and I wonder if someone or something is still out there watching from the trees. But I don't let that thought linger for long. I've learned that the woods can be unpredictable, and you never really know what's out there. But whatever it was, I'm thankful we made it out. And I'll never forget that feeling of being watched in the silence of the forest. I've been planning this trip for weeks. I was excited to spend some time alone in the wilderness, far from the noise of the city. A few days of hiking, setting up camp, and just being surrounded by nature was exactly what I needed to recharge. The plan was simple: drive to the trailhead, hike a few miles in, and camp for 2 nights. Easy enough. The air felt crisp when I stepped out of my car and onto the trail. The woods were dense, with tall pine trees lining both sides of the path. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as a light breeze moved through the branches. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the trail. I should have been worried about the approaching darkness, but I wasn't. I had my flashlight, my tent, and all the gear I needed. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the silence grew thicker. There were no birds, no rustling animals, just an eerie quiet. Every now and then, I would hear the snap of a twig or the distant call of a coyote, but for the most part, it was unnervingly still. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe it was just the time of year, the season changing and animals preparing for winter. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a clearing that seemed like a perfect spot to set up camp. A small stream bubbled nearby, its soft gurgling sound adding a peaceful touch to the otherwise still atmosphere. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small campfire. The fire crackled, sending out small bursts of orange and red sparks into the growing darkness. I sat there, watching the flames dance, and let my thoughts wander. The wilderness was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the isolation. It was the kind of place where, if something were to happen, no one would be around to help. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the quiet getting to me. I ate a quick meal, then lay down in my tent, listening to the crackling fire outside. But as I lay there, the silence seemed to grow, swallowing everything around me. Even the wind had stopped. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, like something or someone moving just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound was different. It was heavier, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently. It wasn't the kind of noise that you would expect from an animal moving through the woods. These steps were too measured, too purposeful. My heart started to race. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out into the dark forest, but I didn't see anything. The light caught only the shadows of trees swaying gently in the wind, but there was no sign of movement. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I was about to call out, maybe to scare away whatever it was, but I stopped myself. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was a person? The thought made my stomach twist. I had heard stories about people getting lost in these woods, and worse, about people who wandered too close to other campers. But no one else had been on the trail when I left, and I hadn't seen a single soul all day. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, clutching the flashlight in my hand. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart jump. The footsteps seemed to come and go, never close enough for me to see anything, but always too close for comfort. I didn't sleep much that night, too afraid to close my eyes for fear of missing something. The only sound that kept me company was the wind and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. When morning finally came, I felt both relieved and exhausted. The forest looked completely different in the daylight, more welcoming, less ominous. The sounds of the night were gone, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I tried to put the previous night out of my mind. Maybe I was just being paranoid, or maybe the isolation had gotten to me. I packed up my tent and decided to head back to the trailhead, cutting my trip short. As I gathered my things, I noticed something strange. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was a set of footprints in the soft earth. They were fresh, too fresh, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. The prints were large, with heavy impressions in the ground, as though the person had been carrying a lot of weight. My heart skipped a beat. I had been alone. I had heard the footsteps last night, but no one had come into the clearing. No one had passed by my camp. I would have heard them. The footprints circled the camp, coming dangerously close to my tent. But then they stopped. The trail faded as it reached the stream, disappearing into the underbrush. There was no sign of anyone else around. It was as though the person had vanished into thin air. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I quickly packed up the rest of my things and started hiking back to the trailhead, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. My thoughts raced, but every time I tried to rationalize it, the unease crept back. The footprints, the footsteps I had heard, it wasn't adding up. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I saw something that made my stomach turn. There, parked at the edge of the lot, was a car I didn't recognize. I hadn't seen it when I left, and there was no one in sight. But as I walked past it to my own car, I noticed something even stranger. There was a set of muddy footprints leading from the woods directly to that car. I didn't stop to investigate. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. The whole trip felt off, like something had been lurking just beyond my reach the entire time. As I drove back into town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, had been watching me the whole time. I never went back to that spot. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, but every time I passed through the woods near that trailhead, I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there is still watching. I've always loved the idea of camping, getting away from everything, enjoying the quiet, and being surrounded by nature felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. It wasn't something I did often, but I'd been itching for some time to do it. I planned for months, and after everything was in place, I took off to a remote site I'd found, far from any towns or busy hiking trails. The spot seemed perfect, nestled by a small lake with dense woods surrounding it. No one else was nearby, and that's exactly how I wanted it. The journey there was long. I'd left early in the morning, and by the time I reached the site, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I quickly unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, firewood, and set up camp. The air had a cool bite to it, and I could hear the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful, serene almost. The lake, a short walk from my campsite, was calm, reflecting the fading orange glow of the sky. I built a small fire, its flames flickering against the darkness as the night settled in. I felt good, surrounded by the fire's warmth and the smell of burning wood. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I kept telling myself it was just the stillness of nature, but something in the back of my mind nagged at me. The quiet was almost unnatural. I'd been camping enough to know that even remote places had their sounds. Insects, small animals, the occasional bird call. But here it was eerily silent. It didn't help that the trees around me were thick, dense, with long shadows creeping across the ground. The wind had picked up a little, and every time a gust would blow through the branches above, I'd hear the leaves rustle in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept my eyes on the fire, trying to shake the feeling. I thought about going to bed early. It wasn't an unusual thought for someone camping alone, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. The air was too still. The silence was too deep. After a few more moments, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of my campsite to calm my nerves. I grabbed a flashlight and began to walk slowly, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I was certain it was nothing, just the dark, the isolation, but I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. As I walked deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam bounced off the trunks of trees, casting strange shadows on the ground. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the shadows seemed to twist and move. I paused, thinking I saw something, just a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting across the forest floor. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I didn't feel like I was alone out there, though. The feeling of being watched intensified the further I walked. It wasn't just the forest itself. It was like someone was out there with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just beyond the reach of my flashlight, hidden in the trees. I stopped walking and listened, but there was nothing, just the wind. No animals.
No distant sounds.
My hand gripped the flashlight a little tighter. The feeling of dread was growing, but I refused to let it get the best of me. I told myself to calm down. I turned around and started back to camp, walking briskly now, not looking over my shoulder. As I approached the clearing where my camp was set up, I felt a sudden wave of relief. I almost started to laugh at myself for getting so worked up over nothing. But then I saw something that froze me in place. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flickering flames, there was something moving. A figure. I couldn't make out any details at first, and I stood there, paralyzed. My first instinct was to call out, but I didn't. Something about the way the figure moved made my stomach tighten. It was wrong. It was too slow, too deliberate. My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't dare move. I stood there in the darkness, watching the figure slowly creep along the tree line. Then it stopped. I stood as still as I could, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't seem to notice me, and I could barely make out what it looked like. It wasn't human, not in the way I understood. It wasn't an animal either. My heart pounded in my chest, and my palms grew sweaty. My mind raced, thinking of the quickest way to get back to the camp and pack up my things. I should leave, I thought. Leave now. But something kept me rooted to the spot, like my body was refusing to listen to my brain. I blinked hard, hoping that when I opened my eyes, it would be gone. But it wasn't. The figure moved again, closer to the firelight. I could see it more clearly now. A tall, dark shape, moving in a strange, jerky way, as though its limbs didn't quite work properly. It wasn't wearing any clothes, and its skin, if that's what it was a sickly pale color that almost glowed in the dim light. My breath hitched as it stepped fully into the firelight. It didn't have a face, just a blank, smooth surface where a face should have been. I don't know what compelled me to act, but suddenly, I turned and bolted back into the woods, running as fast as I could, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I was gasping for air, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get away. I needed to get out of there. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, not caring if I tripped or got hurt. I knew I couldn't stop. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees almost pressing in on me as I moved through them. I could hear the crunch of twigs beneath my feet, but no sounds of pursuit. Nothing followed me. Still, I ran, my body burning with the effort. I kept going until I could barely breathe, until I felt like my legs might give out. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing, and when I stopped to catch my breath, I realized I'd made it far away from the camp. The silence was heavy again, but this time it was comforting. I dared to look around. The forest felt calmer now. My heart was still racing, but the sense of danger had passed. I realized I hadn't seen that thing again. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and called for help. My mind was racing with questions, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was I just imagining things? Had it been my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know. I was terrified. The ranger arrived not long after, responding quickly to my call. When I explained what had happened, he listened but didn't seem to believe me. He said there were no reports of anything unusual in the area, and that it was probably just my nerves getting the better of me. But when I asked him about the strange feeling in the woods and the things I'd seen, he simply told me that sometimes the isolation can mess with your head. I left that night. I packed up everything and drove away, not looking back. The ranger assured me that the area was safe, but I wasn't going to take any chances. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe there was something in the woods that I couldn't explain. I don't know, but I do know that I'll never go camping in that spot again. As for what I saw, I'll never be sure, but I'm convinced of one thing. There are some things in the woods that don't belong there, some things that shouldn't be seen. I had been planning this camping trip for months, eager to get away from the constant hum of everyday life and immerse myself in nature. Just me, my backpack, and the open wilderness. It was the middle of autumn, and the colors of the leaves were changing from green to vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows. Perfect weather for a solo camping trip, or so I thought. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was just beginning to set behind the towering trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I parked my car in the small clearing near the trailhead, making sure to lock it before grabbing my gear. The trail I was taking was fairly well known, winding through thick woods and eventually leading to a small, secluded lake. I was looking forward to the quiet, peaceful solitude that the lake would offer, away from all the noise and bustle of the world. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, but the terrain was rough in places, with roots and rocks making the path uneven. As I walked, I could hear the crunch of dried leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. The air smelled fresh and earthy, mixed with the faint scent of pine. About an hour into the hike, the sun had almost completely disappeared behind the horizon. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky. The campsite I had planned on was another hour or so ahead, but I felt like I was being pulled in a different direction. Something about the silence of the woods felt eerie, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It was the kind of silence that made every small noise, whether the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig, sound unnervingly loud. As I walked deeper into the woods, I realized I had strayed off the main trail. I hadn't meant to, but the path had become less distinct, and the dense trees and underbrush made it difficult to keep track. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The light from my flashlight was the only thing that illuminated my surroundings, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move with me. I considered turning back, but I was stubborn. I had already gone this far and I didn't want to give up. Besides, the lake was just ahead, or so I hoped. At least that's what I kept telling myself. After another half hour of walking through thick underbrush, I finally found a small clearing. The ground was soft and covered with a blanket of fallen leaves. It was perfect for setting up camp. I quickly set up my tent, the silence of the woods around me broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air had grown colder, and I could see my breath misting in the chilly night air. I built a small fire with some dry wood I found nearby, its warmth a welcome relief against the cold. As the flames crackled and popped, I settled down on a nearby log, staring into the fire. There was something calming about the way the flames danced and flickered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if I wasn't alone. My senses were on high alert, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, but all I could see were trees and the occasional flash of movement in the shadows. I tried to brush it off as nothing more than the natural unease that comes with being alone in the woods at night, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, a persistent presence in the back of my mind. I decided to stay close to the fire, thinking that it would offer some comfort. But the fire, as comforting as it was, didn't seem to be enough. Hours passed, and the fire dwindled to little more than glowing embers. I was starting to feel sleepy but didn't want to sleep just yet. I still felt like something was off, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. So, I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees and causing the branches to creak and groan. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ward off the chill that had settled in. That's when I heard it, a faint noise in the distance, like footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the woods. But then I heard it again, this time closer. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot. My heart began to race, and my stomach twisted in knots. I stood up slowly, reaching for the flashlight. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them were good. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The footsteps continued, getting closer with each passing second. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles white. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Should I hide in my tent? Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. I turned off the flashlight and crouched low, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps had stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid. I waited, listening intently, but the sound didn't come again. I slowly stood up, trying to steady myself. I reached for my backpack and fumbled through it, pulling out my map. I had to figure out where I was. It wasn't possible to be lost, not in an area I had been familiar with in the past. But the map didn't make any sense. I couldn't find my location anywhere on it, and the more I stared at it, the more confused I became. It wasn't long before I realized that I wasn't lost in the traditional sense. The forest was disorienting, yes, but this was something else. I had no explanation for why things seemed so different now. Everything around me felt wrong. The trees didn't look like the trees I had passed earlier. The air was thicker, heavier somehow. It was as if the forest itself was closing in on me, trapping me in a place I couldn't understand. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, shoving my gear back into my backpack. The footsteps started up again, but this time they were much louder, closer. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and started running, not caring which direction I went. My mind was racing with panic. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every gust of wind in the trees seemed to chase me, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled out of the woods and into a familiar clearing. The lake. It was dark now, and the water was still, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made it look almost surreal. I didn't care about the lake at that moment. I was just relieved to be out of the woods. But even as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My skin prickled, my every nerve on edge. I spent the night by the lake, too afraid to go back into the woods, but nothing happened. By morning, I had decided to head back to my car. I didn't want to spend another minute in the forest, not after what had happened. The return hike was uneventful, and I eventually made it back to the trailhead. The forest behind me felt vast and mysterious, but I was glad to leave it behind. Back at my car, I took one last look at the woods. The sun was up now, casting golden light on the trees. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, but the feeling from the night before lingered in my mind. I didn't know what I had experienced, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to these woods. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, just me and the wilderness. I had been on several trips before, and I always loved the peace that the forest brought. I liked the quiet, the sound of the leaves rustling in the wind, and the scent of pine that filled the air. I felt like I could always get away from everything when I was out there. But that trip was different. I had picked a campsite a couple of hours away from home. It wasn't a popular spot, so I knew I'd have the place mostly to myself. I had all the usual camping gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, and a small stove. I didn't even bring a lantern. I just had my headlamp, thinking it would be enough. I figured I'd set up camp and spend the night enjoying the peace. The day was perfect when I arrived. The sun high in the sky, the temperature just right, and the wind light. I found a clearing near a small creek, the sound of running water soothing as I set up my tent. The place felt isolated, but not in an unsettling way. I felt comfortable, maybe a little too comfortable. I spent the afternoon unpacking, getting the firewood ready, and making a small campfire. The crackle of the flames was one of those sounds you never really forget, and I took it in, thinking about how peaceful everything was. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself, and in a way it was like the forest was mine, too. But then, as the sun began to set and the forest shadows grew longer, I started to notice something strange. It wasn't anything big at first, just a slight rustle in the trees or the feeling of being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the usual noises of the forest. Animals moving, the wind playing tricks. But the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. My headlamp was already on, and the glow from the fire barely seemed to push back the growing darkness. Night fell hard and fast. The firelight cast strange, shifting shadows, and the sounds of the forest seemed to change. The usual noises of crickets and wind were replaced by a deep, uneasy silence. For a long while, I just sat there by the fire, listening. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something wrong, something I couldn't put my finger on. I glanced around the clearing, and that's when I noticed it. Just past the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, something was moving. At first, I thought it was just a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't look right. It was moving too slowly, too deliberately. It stopped for a moment, and I froze, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence. I grabbed a branch from the fire, using it to poke at the flames. I thought maybe if I made the fire burn brighter, I'd feel better. But the more I tried to calm myself, the worse it got. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something was watching me. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from just outside the fire's light. I didn't dare look directly at it, but I could feel it moving closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I told myself it was just an animal. I had to remind myself of that. It had to be an animal. The rustling grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was so thick, I could hear my own breathing. I sat perfectly still, hoping that whatever it was had moved on. But I didn't dare move. I just waited, and then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible crunch of leaves. Not far from me. I was sure of it now. Something was out there, and it was close. Too close. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing, and grabbed my backpack. I quickly stuffed my things inside, barely thinking straight. I had to get out of there. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't safe. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the tent, and my hands were shaking so much I could barely get the poles together. I wasn't thinking clearly, but I had to get out. I had to get somewhere safe. But the moment I turned my back to the fire, the rustling started again. This time it was louder, more urgent. It was like whatever was out there was moving closer with purpose. I wasn't imagining it. Something was there. I didn't look back. I just ran. I don't know how far I ran or how long, but I knew I had to put as much distance between me and whatever was following me. The forest was a blur as I moved through it, the moonlight barely piercing through the thick trees. I stumbled, tripped, and barely avoided falling into the creek. Finally, I stopped, breathless and panicked, and I looked around. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea where I was. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of rushing water close by. The silence was deafening. I couldn't go back to the campsite. I couldn't even bring myself to look in that direction. The idea of going back there made my stomach turn. I knew something was out there, something that had been watching me. The feeling was too real. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. The fear was overwhelming. I wanted to scream, to run, but I stayed frozen. I couldn't afford to make any noise. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I heard it. A crack of a branch snapping in the distance. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I wasn't alone, and this time I knew it. But instead of running, I stayed still, trying to control my breathing. I wasn't going to make it easy for whatever was out there to find me. I just have to wait it out. The fear was paralyzing, but I had no other choice. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. My whole body tensed, and I felt my muscles aching from holding still. But then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. I didn't dare move for a long time. I stayed crouched, listening, waiting, but nothing came. No more footsteps, no more sounds. It was like whatever had been out there had decided to leave. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually, I gathered the courage to stand up. Slowly, I started to move. My heart was still pounding, but I knew I couldn't just stay there forever. The night felt endless, but eventually, I made my way back to the campsite. The fire was just a small pile of embers now, but the strange feeling that had hung over the place was gone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every sound around me, but nothing came. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stay another minute in that forest. Whatever had been out there watching me had left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just waiting. I haven't been camping since. That trip changed something in me. I used to love the peace of the wilderness, but now every rustle, every crunch of leaves, makes my heart race. I don't know what I felt that night, but I know I wasn't alone, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. I never thought much about camping in the woods. I had always preferred the comfort of home, the safety of knowing what's around me, and the feeling that I could easily escape from any situation. But when my friend Jake suggested a weekend trip to the mountains, I agreed. It wasn't like I had any real reason to be scared of the outdoors. After all, what could possibly go wrong in a place so beautiful and peaceful? We arrived at the campground in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air was cool, with a crisp breeze that made the leaves rustle and the scent of pine fill my nostrils, the kind of smell you only get in the forest. It felt like a scene from a movie, peaceful, calm, and serene. But as we unloaded our gear from the car, I started to feel an unease creeping in. I brushed it off as nothing. I wasn't sure what it was, but it wasn't enough to stop me from getting excited about the weekend. I had a new tent, new gear, and was ready for a break from the daily grind. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. We found a spot near the edge of the forest, just far enough from the other campers to enjoy some peace and quiet, but close enough to not feel too isolated. Jake set up the tent while I unpacked the rest of our gear. Sleeping bags, a small stove, and a cooler with enough food and drinks to last us for the weekend. The fire pit was already set, and the wood was stacked in a neat pile beside it, waiting to be lit. The whole place had a rustic charm to it, and for the first few hours, everything felt just right. By the time night fell, we had a fire going, and we were sitting around it, enjoying the warmth as the temperature dropped. The crackling of the flames, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds around us. It was peaceful, too peaceful, and that's when it hit me. The woods felt off. I couldn't explain it. There were no sounds from the usual wildlife you'd expect in the forest. No rustling of leaves from squirrels or birds moving through the trees. It was eerily silent, except for the noise of the fire and the occasional wind whispering through the branches. I tried to push the feeling aside. Just the quiet of nature, I told myself, but the unease kept building. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. Jake didn't seem to notice. He was enjoying himself, roasting marshmallows and telling stories about some of the other trips he had been on. But I couldn't focus on anything he was saying. My eyes kept darting around the dark forest, and my ears strained to hear anything that might explain why I felt so on edge. Eventually, the conversation dwindled, and we both fell into a comfortable silence, gazing into the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was watching us. I kept glancing around, looking into the darkness beyond the firelight, but there was nothing there. No movement, no eyes staring back at me. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that we weren't alone. At some point, Jake decided to go to bed. He had already finished his marshmallow roasting, and the fire was beginning to burn lower. I stayed by the fire for a while longer, unwilling to admit to myself that I was feeling nervous. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the flames, before the sound broke through the silence. A twig snapped in the distance. It was faint at first, like someone stepping lightly on the forest floor. I froze, straining to hear. The sound didn't repeat, but I couldn't ignore it. I stood up slowly, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. The fire cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the corners of my vision. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I waited a few minutes, trying to convince myself to relax. When the sound didn't come again, I decided to head to the tent. The sooner I could get under the covers, the better. I wasn't about to spend the night sitting by the fire alone with my nerves on edge. As I walked toward the tent, I glanced back one last time at the forest. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement, something tall and dark moving between the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was big, and it was fast. My stomach dropped. I felt a rush of adrenaline hit my system. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I quickly ducked into the tent, zipping it up behind me. I sat in the dark for a while, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an animal, and I needed to relax. But the image of that dark figure in the woods lingered in my mind. I didn't sleep much that night, Every little noise from outside made me jump. The wind whistling through the trees sounded like whispers, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me think someone, or something, was out there, moving in the shadows. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing, unable to shake the feeling of dread. By morning, I was exhausted. I tried to tell myself it was all just my imagination, that nothing had happened, and I needed to let it go. But something inside me couldn't. The memory of that figure in the woods, moving so fast and silently, gnawed at me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't feel safe anymore. Jake didn't seem bothered. He was eager to go for a hike. The sun had risen, and the woods looked different in the daylight. The peaceful, serene atmosphere from the night before was back, but the nagging feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I agreed to go with him. We packed some snacks, water, and our backpacks and set off along the trail. The woods were quiet, but not as still as they had been the night before. There were birds singing, the sound of small animals moving through the underbrush. For a while, it felt normal again. I started to relax, but the unease never fully left. We hiked for a couple of hours, taking in the beautiful views and stopping to rest whenever we needed. The sun was shining brightly now, and the temperature had risen enough that I started sweating through my shirt. Jake seemed completely at ease, chatting about random things as we made our way deeper into the forest. Then we reached a clearing. It was a small, open area with thick grass and wildflowers scattered about. There were a few fallen logs that we sat on, enjoying the rest and the view. But something about it felt wrong. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like we shouldn't have stopped here. As we rested, I kept my eyes on the trees around us. The forest seemed more alive here, more watchful. I didn't want to look too obvious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was observing us from the edge of the clearing. And that's when I heard it again, a twig snapping. This time it was much closer, and I could almost feel the weight of whatever had made the noise. I didn't look in that direction immediately. I didn't want to seem obvious, but my heart was racing. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, no movement, just the stillness of the woods. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Jake didn't seem to notice. He was leaning back on his log, relaxed, his eyes closed. I wanted to tell him what I was feeling, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the sounds kept coming. It wasn't just twigs snapping anymore. It was like something was moving around us, circling us, just beyond the tree line. It was too quiet to be a person, too deliberate to be an animal. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wanted to get up, to leave, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. But then Jake stood up suddenly. He was looking around, his expression changing. "I don't like this," he said, more to himself than to me. "It feels wrong. We should go." I didn't argue. I grabbed my backpack, and we started walking back to the trailhead. The sounds followed us, keeping pace with us. But when I dared to look behind us, there was nothing there. We made it back to the campsite without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I felt too on edge to enjoy anything, even when Jake suggested we cook up some dinner and relax by the fire again. That night, I barely slept, and when morning came, we packed up and left without looking back. The woods felt like they were holding something back, watching us, waiting for us to leave. The drive back was long, and neither of us spoke much. The unease I had felt the entire time had followed us home. When I finally got back to my apartment, I thought about it all again. The woods, the noises, the feeling of being watched. I realized one thing for sure: I would never go camping again. I thought I was prepared for this trip. I'd spent weeks planning, reading blogs, watching videos on camping and survival, even practicing how to set up the tent in my backyard. I wanted to be sure nothing would go wrong on my solo camping trip. I'd chosen a secluded spot, far from any trails or campgrounds, deep in the woods. It felt perfect, the kind of place where I could unplug and just enjoy nature. I drove for hours, leaving behind the last traces of civilization until I reached the trailhead. I grabbed my backpack, checked the weather one last time on my phone, and then turned it off to avoid distractions. The air was crisp and fresh, and the sky above was clear. The kind of weather that made everything feel right, like it was meant to be. The hike itself was tough. The trail wound up through dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy of leaves above. The sounds of the woods were all around me. The rustling of leaves, birds calling to one another, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I tried not to let the quiet get to me. At first, I didn't think much of the eerie silence, but as the hours passed, it started to feel heavier. The forest around me seemed too still, as if it was holding its breath. After a few hours of hiking, I found a perfect clearing near a small creek. The ground was soft, and the sound of the water trickling over the rocks was peaceful. I set up camp, carefully choosing a spot away from the creek to avoid flooding if it rained. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I built a small fire and prepared my dinner, nothing fancy, just some freeze-dried food and a cup of tea. The night came quickly, and with it, a deep silence. The fire crackled, and the stars above were bright, but everything around me was so still. I told myself it was just the woods, nothing to worry about. But as the night deepened, something started to feel off. It wasn't the kind of fear that grips you in a nightmare. No, this was more subtle, like being watched without being able to see who was there. I sat by the fire, the warmth from the flames wrapping around me, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But then I heard it, a soft rustling in the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was so faint, I wondered if I imagined it. I stood up, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. There it was again, a crack of branches, but nothing was there. My eyes scanned the darkness, but the trees seemed to shift in a way that made it impossible to see anything clearly. I went back to the fire, telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or something smaller. I tried to focus on the warmth of the flames and the flickering shadows, but the rustling sound kept coming back. It was too regular to be a wild animal, too deliberate. I felt a chill spread through my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood up and grabbed a stick, ready to defend myself if I needed to. The idea that someone, or something, was out there, watching me, filled me with dread. But as the minutes stretched on, the noises stopped. I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe the forest was playing tricks on me. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. The woods were big, and I was alone. But the stillness returned, and with it came the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Couldn't shake it. My eyes kept darting to the trees, searching for anything that didn't belong. I looked down at the fire, then back to the woods. The rustling came again, only this time it was louder. A crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I scanned the trees, the brush, the shadows, but still nothing. My breathing was heavy now, and my pulse was racing. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just a bear or a raccoon. But then came the sound of footsteps. It was faint at first, just a soft crunch of leaves, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there moving around the clearing. I tried to control my breathing, to stay as quiet as possible, but the fear was overwhelming. My hand shook as I turned off the flashlight, plunging the camp into total darkness. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything, that would tell me what was happening. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear them clearly, each one distinct, each one deliberate. Slowly, I reached for my knife, the cold steel reassuring in my hand. I moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, my eyes adjusting to the dark. The steps were too rhythmic to be an animal. They were too measured, too human. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I run? Should I confront whatever was out there? My mind raced, but I didn't have time to think. The next noise I heard wasn't footsteps. It was a low growl, something feral and primal that sent a wave of terror through my chest. The hair on my arms stood up as I turned back toward the fire. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't human. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and began to run. The growl followed me, echoing through the trees. Couldn't look back. I just ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could, branches slapping my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. The dark was oppressive, and I felt every muscle in my body aching from the fear and the strain. I didn't stop running until I found a road. It felt like I had been running for hours, but I couldn't tell. My chest was heaving, and every sound seemed amplified in the night. I stood there, panting, staring back at the dark forest behind me. Nothing followed me out, but I didn't dare look for long. I knew it wasn't safe to go back. I made my way back to civilization as quickly as I could, not daring to stop. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure. The forest is not as empty as it seems, and I'll never be so sure of my safety again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. I've always loved the outdoors, and after a hectic couple of months at work, I was looking forward to disconnecting for a few days in the woods. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the forest and the crackling of the campfire. I had chosen a remote spot in a national park, miles away from the nearest town. It was the kind of place that felt peaceful and isolated, perfect for recharging. Little did I know, it would turn into something that would haunt me forever. I drove up early on Friday, setting up camp just before the sun began to set. The place was quiet, with just the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The air was crisp and smelled fresh, exactly what I needed. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and made sure to get a good fire going. As night fell, I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth against the chill. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I thought about how nice it was to get away from it all. I had brought some food, enough to last the weekend, and planned to do some hiking the next day. The only sounds were the occasional snap of a twig from the wind and the fire crackling in the center of the camp. The first night was calm, uneventful, and I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the setup. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. I unzipped my tent and took a deep breath of the cool, fresh air. It felt good to be in the wilderness, away from the constant noise of the city. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my backpack, packed some snacks, water, and my camera, and set off on a hike. The trails here were unmarked, not well-traveled, and that's exactly why I liked it. I could explore at my own pace without running into anyone else. The forest was dense, with tall trees and thick underbrush. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt a strange sense of quiet, the kind that seems unnatural in a place like this. There was no wind, no animal sounds, just silence. I brushed it off as normal. The deeper you go into the forest, the quieter it gets, right? I continued on, trying to keep my mind occupied with the beauty of the place. The light filtering through the trees, the smell of pine needles, and the soft ground beneath my boots. I came across a small creek, the water flowing gently over rocks. I sat down by the creek for a while, dipping my fingers in the cool water and taking in the tranquility of the moment. As I was about to stand up and continue, I noticed something. At first, it was subtle, a slight movement in the distance. Something was moving in the brush. I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it didn't seem to move like an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I stood up, straining my eyes to make sense of what I was seeing. Nothing. I shrugged it off as my imagination running wild. Maybe just the wind playing tricks with the branches. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly decided it was time to head back to camp. I retraced my steps, trying to dismiss the unease that had crept into my mind. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me. It wasn't the usual feeling of being in the woods. It wasn't the unease of being alone in the wild. It was something different, something I couldn't put my finger on. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I quickened my pace, but the silence was deafening. No birds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, just the sound of my boots crunching against the forest floor. When I finally reached camp, the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. I checked my surroundings, half expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye, but there was nothing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and I spent the evening around the campfire, eating and trying to relax. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The stillness of the forest was unnerving, and the thought of being out there alone was starting to feel less like freedom and more like a mistake. Nightfall came again, and with it, a deeper sense of unease. The fire crackled, the wind started to pick up, but it wasn't the usual breeze. It was a gusting, almost erratic wind that didn't seem to have any pattern. It whistled through the trees, making the branches sway and groan in a way that felt unnatural. Every now and then, a twig would snap, but there was no animal to be seen. No sign of life. I went to bed early again, my mind restless. The wind howled outside, and every so often, I heard a thud against the tent, like something heavy hitting the fabric. I convinced myself it was just the wind or a branch falling, but my mind wouldn't let go of the thought that someone was out there. The night was long. I barely slept, tossing and turning, the sound of the wind outside keeping me awake. Every time I thought I was drifting off, I'd hear another thud, another crack. It felt like something was circling the camp, watching, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted. I didn't even feel like having breakfast. I packed up my tent, eager to get out of there, but I still had to break camp, clean up, and make sure everything was packed. The sky was cloudy, and there was a chill in the air. I was already dreading another night in this eerie place. As I began to pack, I noticed something strange. The fire pit, which I had carefully cleaned and doused the night before, was disturbed. The logs had been moved, and there were fresh footprints around the site. Footprints that definitely didn't belong to me. They were large, heavy prints, as if someone or something had been circling my camp while I slept. My heart raced. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't seen anyone, but the evidence was right there. Someone had been close. I immediately grabbed my things and started packing faster, my mind spinning with thoughts of who or what could have been out there. The footprints led away from the camp and deeper into the forest. I didn't want to follow them. I didn't want to know. I quickly finished packing, feeling more vulnerable than I ever had before. I made sure the fire was completely out, packed everything into my car, and started the engine. The sound of the engine was the most comforting thing I had heard all weekend. As I pulled out of the campsite and onto the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, over an hour away. I didn't want to risk stopping any sooner. Once I was in town, I took a breath, realizing how tense I had been. I'd made it out, safe. But as I looked back towards the woods in my rearview mirror, I couldn't help but wonder, what had been out there? What had been watching me? I never went back to that part of the woods, and every time I drive past a remote campground now, I'm reminded of the strange feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting, circling. But at least I got out, and that's the most important thing, isn't it? I never did figure out what happened that weekend, but I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, it's better to trust your instincts and leave when something doesn't feel right. I'm glad I listened to mine before it was too late. I had always been a fan of hiking and camping. There was something about being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by the calmness of nature, that made me feel both alive and at peace. It was my usual weekend ritual to escape the noise of everyday life and take a solo camping trip, far from the nearest town. The weekend before, I had planned a trip up to a spot I had heard about from an old hiker I met a few months ago. It was remote, quiet, and isolated, perfect for what I wanted. I wanted nothing more than to enjoy some solitude, set up my tent, and watch the world go by in silence. The trailhead was just off the main road, marked by a faded wooden sign that said, Pine Ridge Trail. I had heard that it was about an hour's hike to a beautiful clearing with a lake, just the kind of place to camp and unwind. My backpack was packed with all the usual essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few tools just in case. The weather was great, not too hot, and not too cold, so I figured it was a perfect day to go. I parked my car near the trailhead and checked my gear one last time. Everything seemed to be in order, so I set off down the trail. The air was fresh, and the rustling of the leaves overhead filled the space with an almost soothing sound. The path was well marked and easy to follow, with the occasional wooden sign pointing the way. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I couldn't help but appreciate the beauty of my surroundings. The sunlight streamed through the canopy of trees, casting soft, dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped, and squirrels dashed between the trees. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. By the time I reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. The lake glistened in the fading sunlight, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sky. It was just as the hiker had described, beautiful, peaceful, and completely isolated. I set up my tent near the shore, taking my time to make sure everything was in place. The ground was soft with moss, and the air smelled of pine and fresh water. I felt completely at ease. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small campfire near the lake's edge. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth felt comforting against the cooling evening air. I ate my dinner, sitting back and watching the flickering firelight dance across the water. The night grew quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I leaned back, letting the peace of the moment wash over me. It was the kind of evening I had been craving. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something odd. There was a subtle feeling in the air, like I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, I was in the middle of a forest, and animals could be lurking in the shadows. Still, the feeling lingered, creeping at the edges of my thoughts. Every now and then, I'd hear a sound, a twig snapping, a rustle in the bushes, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to brush it off. I was used to hiking alone, and I had camped in isolated places before. Nothing bad had ever happened, but tonight felt different. The darkness seemed deeper, more oppressive. The air was heavier, as if it was filled with something I couldn't quite grasp. I finished my meal quickly, then retreated to my tent, eager to get some rest. I zipped up the entrance and crawled into my sleeping bag. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire outside crackled before dying down to embers. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the roof of the tent. The silence outside was almost too much to bear. It felt like the whole forest had fallen completely still. Then, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A noise, faint but unmistakable. A soft, crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. It was coming from outside my tent. For a long moment, I didn't move. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps continued, slowly, deliberately. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving closer. I could hear the leaves crackling underfoot, the soft rustle of branches brushing against each other. The sound grew louder, and I felt my pulse quicken. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was out there. I didn't know what to do. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road. My phone had no signal, and I had no way of calling for help. I considered grabbing my knife, but it felt too far away, and I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I tried to calm my breathing, willing myself to think clearly. Maybe it was an animal, a bear, a deer, or something else. But the footsteps sounded too deliberate, too controlled. This wasn't the kind of noise a wild animal would make. I reached for the flashlight at the side of my sleeping bag, carefully pulling it out. The footsteps had stopped for a moment, and I thought I could hear something else now. Something faint but present. A low, almost imperceptible whispering, like voices in the wind. But the wind wasn't blowing. The air was still, and yet I could hear it, just on the edge of my hearing. I pressed the button on the flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the darkness. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling. I aimed the light at the tent entrance, shining it toward the trees just beyond the campfire. But there was nothing. Still, I wasn't convinced. I could feel eyes on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I spent what felt like hours staring into the darkness, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had someone been following me? Was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Or was there something more? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I decided to take a risk. I unzipped the entrance of the tent just a crack, enough to peek outside. The fire was almost out, leaving only a faint glow behind. I scanned the area, trying to see anything out of place. My heart was still racing, but my eyes couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The lake shimmered in the weak light, the trees were still, and there was nothing else moving. But then, in the distance, I saw something, just a flicker of movement. A shadow darted between the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I snapped the zipper back shut, my mind spinning. It wasn't an animal. It was too fast, too deliberate. It had to be someone. I didn't know what to do. Should I pack up and leave? But the thought of walking back down the trail in the dead of night, with no way of knowing who or what was out there, made my stomach turn. I was more vulnerable now than I had ever been. I had no choice but to stay put and hope the night passed without incident. The rest of the night dragged on in a haze of anxiety. Every little sound set me on edge. Every movement outside my tent made my heart leap into my throat. But nothing happened. No one came close again. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. The birds resumed their morning songs, and the forest came to life with the gentle sounds of the day. I didn't waste any time packing up. I was eager to leave the woods behind and head back to the safety of my car. The hike down the trail felt much longer than it had on the way up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But nothing. The trail was as empty as it had been the day before. When I finally reached the trailhead, I breathed a sigh of relief. I wasn't sure what had happened that night, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I loaded up my gear and drove away, the road stretching out ahead of me, and the city's familiar noise never felt so comforting. I've been camping and hiking plenty of times since, but that night still stays with me. I can't explain what happened, and maybe I never will, but I know one thing for sure. When you're out in the wild, alone and far from help, the things you think you hear or think you see can be far more unsettling than anything you'll find in a horror movie. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and the wilderness. I've always loved camping. There's something about being away from the noise and the bustle of daily life that gives you a sense of clarity, like you can breathe freely again. But that weekend, the woods didn't feel like the usual sanctuary. I had set up camp by a small, calm lake, surrounded by towering pine trees. The sun was low, casting long shadows, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine needles and fresh earth. The silence was almost overwhelming, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves. After setting up my tent and gathering firewood, I sat by the lake to take it all in. The stillness felt different, like the world was holding its breath. Night came quickly, and as the sky darkened, I lit a fire. It crackled and popped, the orange flames dancing against the darkening sky. I threw a few logs on, listening to the comforting sound of the fire. But there was something else, a faint rustling in the trees on the other side of the lake. At first, I chalked it up to wind or a small animal, but then the rustling grew louder, more deliberate, like something large was moving around. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't see anything, but the movement was unmistakable. I thought about grabbing a flashlight, but I didn't want to make any noise. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but that didn't feel right. I went back to my fire, keeping my eyes on the shadows, trying to dismiss the feeling of unease that was creeping into my mind. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes in the darkness. For a while, nothing happened. The night seemed to calm down, and I tried to relax, convincing myself it was nothing. But then the rustling started again, closer this time. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable now, like someone, or something, was walking through the woods on the other side of the lake. The dry leaves crunched under heavy footsteps. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. No sign of anything in the trees. I started to feel ridiculous. It was just my imagination running wild, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I decided to call it a night, retreating into my tent, though I couldn't sleep. I lay wide awake, listening to the sounds of the night, the soft lapping of the water, the occasional crack of a branch in the trees. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my tent that I snapped upright in fear. I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling my camp. I held my breath, praying whatever it was wouldn't find me. I could hear it getting closer, the crunch of leaves beneath heavy feet. Then silence. I waited in the dark, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence stretched on, unbearable. But after a long while, I heard it again. A soft tapping on the outside of my tent, followed by a low growl, almost imperceptible, like it was coming from the ground itself. I held my breath, my pulse quickened, and my thoughts raced. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? No, those animals don't act like this, I told myself. This was something else. I had no idea how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear. The noise didn't stop. Whatever it was still there, moving around my tent, sniffing, pacing. My only option was to wait it out and hope it left. Morning finally came, but I didn't feel safe. I slowly crawled out of my sleeping bag, my muscles stiff with tension. I kept the flashlight in my hand, ready to shine it at anything that moved. As I opened the flap of the tent, the first light of day revealed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Large, heavy footprints circled the campsite. They weren't animal tracks. They were too big, too human-like. They were barefoot, the toes clearly visible in the damp earth. And they came right up to the tent. I didn't know what to make of it. Person, out here in the woods, miles from the nearest town? I had been alone the entire time. The idea that someone had been silently watching me all night chilled me to the core. I felt like I was being hunted. I knew I had to leave, fast. Packing up my camp was a blur of hurried movements. I barely noticed the beauty of the lake or the towering trees as I hurriedly shoved everything into my backpack. My mind was focused on one thing, getting out of there. But as I was pulling the last strap of my backpack tight, I heard someone, calling from the woods. It was faint, a voice so far away I could barely make it out. But there was no mistaking it. It was a human voice, low and muffled. I turned and looked toward the treeline, my heart skipping a beat. The voice came again, closer this time. But it wasn't a cry for help or a friendly greeting. It was like someone was calling my name, but it was off, distorted, twisted. I didn't stay to find out who or what was calling me. I ran faster than I ever thought I could, stumbling through the thick underbrush, dodging trees and leaping over roots. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and shaking. I threw my backpack into the trunk, got in, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and as I pulled out of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the woods, far from the campsite that had almost been my last. And as I looked out at the road ahead, I promised myself one thing. I would never camp alone in those woods again. I never liked camping in the deep woods, but my friends insisted. They promised it would be a good experience, one we'd remember forever. I wasn't so sure. There was something about the vast emptiness of nature that made me uneasy. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the occasional animal felt isolating, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Still, I agreed, thinking that I was probably just being paranoid. We packed our gear the night before. Tents, sleeping bags, food, flashlights, and the usual camping essentials. We had our hiking boots, a first aid kit, and even a small stove for cooking. The plan was simple. Drive up to the trailhead, hike a few miles in, and set up camp by the lake. Perfect weekend getaway, or so it seemed. The drive out was uneventful. The landscape gradually changed from the city's hustle and bustle to the quiet calm of rural roads. Soon, we were on a narrow, winding path leading up to the trailhead, the trees growing thicker as we got further from civilization. I could see the sun dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows on the ground. We parked the car at the trailhead and started unloading the gear. The air smelled fresh and earthy, but there was also a slight chill in it that made me shiver. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, feeling the weight of the silence. There was no sound except for the rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was almost too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. We started our hike, the dirt path uneven beneath our boots, leading us deeper into the forest. The trees were towering, their branches tangled in a canopy above us, blocking out much of the remaining daylight. The sound of our footsteps seemed loud in the stillness, but otherwise, the woods felt untouched, like we were the first ones to set foot here. After a couple of hours of hiking, we reached the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the sky and trees like a perfect mirror. It was beautiful, but it gave me an eerie feeling, like something wasn't quite right. The place seemed too perfect, too quiet. We set up our camp, pitching the tents close to the water's edge. I could hear the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake, but that was it. No other sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves from distant creatures. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped quickly. We gathered around the campfire, the flames crackling and casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. We joked and talked, trying to ignore the strange, heavy silence of the forest around us. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but something kept nagging at me. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It was like they were watching us, waiting for us to slip up. The first sign that something was wrong came when I went to fetch more firewood. I walked a few feet away from the camp, my flashlight bouncing off the trees. There was nothing unusual at first, just the shadows of branches and leaves. But then, I heard something, a faint rustle, like something moving through the brush, just beyond the reach of my light. I froze, shining the beam in that direction, but there was nothing there. I stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of the sound. Could have been an animal, I told myself. Probably a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. But something about it felt off. I returned to the camp, brushing it off as nerves. But as the night went on, the feeling only grew stronger. The air seemed heavier, colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire, the embers hissing as they were smothered, and crawled into our tents. I tried to sleep, but the silence outside was deafening. The wind had died down, and there was no sound of animals, no crickets, no nothing, just the eerie stillness of the woods. I tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd heard earlier. What was out there? What was watching us? Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off, exhaustion taking over. But my sleep was restless, filled with strange, fragmented dreams. I woke up a few times, hearing faint noises outside, but I couldn't bring myself to get up and check. It felt too late, too cold, and the idea of leaving the safety of my tent seemed insane. The next morning, I woke up to an odd sight. The camp was quiet, too quiet. My friends were still asleep, but something felt off. I stepped outside my tent, stretching and yawning, but the moment I stepped into the open air, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, scattered around the camp, were several large footprints. They weren't animal prints, they were too big and too distinct like human footprints, but they were much too large for any person I knew. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could have been out here? The nearest town was miles away, and we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. The tracks circled the camp, coming so close to our tents that I could see the imprint of someone crouching down near the edges, just out of reach. Whoever it was had been watching us while we slept. I immediately woke up my friends, showing them the prints. They were just as freaked out as I was, but we couldn't figure out what to do. The footprints were still fresh, but whoever had left them was long gone. We packed up our camp as quickly as we could, trying to stay calm, but every sound from the woods made our nerves fray further. We hiked out of the forest as fast as we could, keeping our eyes peeled for anything unusual. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still following us, just out of sight. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing in the trees, watching us, but no one was there. When we finally reached the car, I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. We were out of there. I couldn't get away from that place fast enough. As we drove away from the trailhead, I looked in the rearview mirror. The forest was vast, stretching out endlessly behind us, but there was no sign of anyone following us. We had made it out. But as we left, I couldn't help but wonder who had been out there. What had they wanted? And why had they been watching us so closely? It's been weeks since that trip, but I still can't shake the memory of those footprints. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'll never go camping in that forest again. It started as a solo camping trip, an escape from the noise of daily life. I had always loved the outdoors, and spending a few days alone in the wilderness felt like the reset I needed. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, a place I'd researched online. It wasn't a popular campsite. No paved roads, no facilities, just miles of untamed forest. That was the appeal. I wanted isolation. I parked my car at a small dirt pull-off, packed my gear, and hiked about 5 miles in. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path. It twisted through dense trees, across streams, and over rocky inclines. By the time I reached my intended campsite, the sun was dipping low. The spot was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a view of a nearby ridge and a trickling creek a short walk away. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and built a small fire. The solitude felt refreshing. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the wind rustling the trees, and the occasional bird call. That first night passed peacefully. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and spent hours staring at the stars. Out here, away from city lights, the sky was a canvas of glittering dots. When I finally crawled into my tent, sleep came easily. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through the tent. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek upstream, weaving through the forest and stopping occasionally to admire the scenery. The forest felt alive but calm, a mix of chirping birds, buzzing insects, and the faint gurgle of water. I felt completely alone, and I loved it. Around midday, I came across something strange. In a small clearing, I found a pile of rocks arranged in a neat circle. At first, I thought it might be an old fire pit, but there were no signs of ash or burnt wood. It looked deliberate, almost ceremonial. Struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was something left by another hiker, though I hadn't seen a single person since leaving my car. I continued exploring until the sun was low in the sky, then made my way back to camp. That night, I felt a little less at ease. The pile of rocks lingered in my mind, though I couldn't explain why it bothered me. To distract myself, I built a larger fire and kept it going longer than the night before. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves made me glance over my shoulder. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being silly and crawled into my tent. Sleep came slower that night, and I woke several times to the sound of something moving outside. Each time, I lay perfectly still, holding my breath and listening. The sounds were faint, maybe an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Just outside my campsite, near the edge of the clearing, I saw footprints. Human footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft dirt. They hadn't been there the day before. My first thought was that someone had stumbled across my camp during the night, but why wouldn't they have announced themselves? And why were the prints so close to my tent? The thought sent a shiver through me. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a coincidence or even my own tracks from the day before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I stuck closer to camp, hesitant to venture too far. The forest, which had felt so peaceful before, now seemed oppressive. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. That evening, as I was collecting wood for the fire, I found something else. Tied to a tree near the creek was a piece of cloth, frayed and weathered. It looked like it had been there for a while, but I hadn't noticed it the day before. It was an unsettling find. Why would someone leave it there? Was it a marker? A warning? My imagination ran wild with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. That night, I kept the fire going as long as I could, feeding it stick after stick until I ran out of wood. Even then, I stayed up, clutching my flashlight and listening intently. The forest was alive with noise, but it all felt wrong. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch. Each sound felt amplified, menacing. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever was out here, I didn't want to find out. I packed my gear in record time and started the hike back to my car. The trail felt different on the way out. The trees seemed closer, the shadows longer. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. About halfway back, I found another pile of rocks. This one was smaller, but it was the same deliberate arrangement. It hadn't been there on my way in. My pace quickened. I no longer cared about the weight of my pack or the strain on my legs. I just wanted to be out of the forest. The last mile was the worst. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every step felt like it was being matched by something unseen. When I finally broke through the trees and saw my car, I nearly cried with relief. I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped off without looking back. Even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. The experience has stayed with me, a constant shadow in the back of my mind. I don't know what I encountered out there, but I'm not eager to find out. That trip cured me of my love for solitude in the wilderness. I haven't been camping since. It started as an ordinary camping trip, the kind I'd done a dozen times before. The plan was simple: hike into the forest, set up camp by the lake, spend the weekend fishing, reading, and enjoying some solitude. The forest, dense and sprawling, was familiar to me. I'd grown up exploring its trails and knew most of them by heart. This time, I decided to push a little deeper, heading to a spot I'd only visited once years ago, a secluded clearing by a small, crystal-clear lake. The hike in was uneventful. The weather was perfect, the air crisp and cool, with just enough cloud cover to make it comfortable. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, some food, and the basics. The trail narrowed as I went deeper into the forest, but I relished the quiet. There was something calming about the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. The lake was just as I remembered it, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The water shimmered in the soft light, and there wasn't another soul in sight. Perfect. I set up my tent a few yards from the shoreline and gathered some wood for a fire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was settled in, sipping coffee from a tin mug and staring at the orange and pink hues fading over the lake. The first night was peaceful. The sounds of the forest lulled me to sleep. Crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. When I woke up, the morning was cool and misty, with the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I spent the day fishing, catching a couple of decent-sized trout, which I cooked over the fire for dinner. Life felt simple and good, but things began to change on the second night. It was subtle at first. As I sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet the forest had become. The usual symphony of nocturnal life was absent. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive silence that made me uneasy. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that I was overthinking it. Maybe the temperature had dropped too much, or maybe it was just one of those quiet nights. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but something felt off. I kept waking up, startled by sounds I couldn't quite place. A faint snapping of twigs, a distant rustling, the kind of noises that were too deliberate to be the wind. Each time, I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. About 10 feet from my tent, the ground was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged through the underbrush. The tracks weren't animal prints. They looked like wide, shallow grooves. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a fallen branch had been dragged by the wind, but there were no branches nearby that matched the size. I decided to explore a bit, hoping to find some logical explanation. I followed the tracks for a while, but they eventually disappeared into a tangle of bushes. Frustrated, I turned back, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I spent the rest of the day fishing and reading, but I couldn't fully relax. The sense of unease lingered. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were closer and more distinct. Footsteps, not the light, random steps of an animal, but deliberate, heavy ones. They circled my camp, stopping and starting as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was listening. My heart pounded as I lay there in my sleeping bag, too scared to move. I gripped my flashlight tightly, debating whether to shine it outside, but fear held me back. What if I saw something I didn't want to see? The footsteps eventually faded, but sleep didn't come. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and rustle setting my nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, half expecting to find nothing. But the ground told a different story. More tracks, like the ones I'd seen before, crisscrossed the area around my tent. They seemed to come from and lead to nowhere, as if whatever had made them had simply appeared and vanished. Panic set in. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the main trail. As I packed up, I felt exposed, as if eyes were watching me from the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my pulse racing. The hike back was a blur. Every snap of a twig, every shadow seemed like a threat. The forest, once my sanctuary, now felt hostile. About halfway back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A small piece of fabric snagged on a branch, blue, like the shirt I'd worn the day before. But I hadn't gone this way during my exploration. My mind raced with questions. How did it get there? Had someone or something been following me? I quickened my pace, my thoughts spiraling. The forest felt endless, the trail winding and unfamiliar despite my many trips here. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn. My map and compass confirmed I was on the right path, but the growing sense of disorientation made me second-guess everything. As evening approached, I realized I wouldn't make it out before dark. The thought of spending another night in the forest terrified me, but pushing on without light was too dangerous. I found a spot near the trail and set up a makeshift camp. This time, I didn't bother with a fire. I wanted to stay hidden. The night was a nightmare. The footsteps returned, closer and more frequent. At one point, I heard breathing low, heavy, and unmistakably human. It was just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I froze, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound lingered for what felt like an eternity before retreating. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn finally came, I packed up and practically ran down the trail. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. By mid-morning, I finally reached the parking lot where my car was. The sight of it brought a wave of relief so intense I almost cried. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and didn't look back. It's been weeks since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. I've gone over it again and again, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was another person messing with me, though why anyone would go to such lengths in such a remote area is beyond me. Maybe it was my own mind playing tricks, paranoia feeding on the isolation. But the tracks, the breathing, those weren't imaginary. I haven't been camping since. The forest, once a place of peace and adventure, now feels tainted. Every time I think about going back, my chest tightens, and I remember the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, the feeling of being watched, and the sheer, unshakable terror of that final night. Whatever was out there, I don't want to meet it again. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, nestled in a clearing far from the main road. I had rented it for a week, thinking it would be the perfect place to clear my head after months of relentless work. It was advertised as remote, peaceful, and simple, exactly what I needed. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees, fresh air, and silence seemed perfect. An escape from emails, meetings, and the constant buzz of the city. The first day was uneventful. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low in the sky. The cabin was modest, with a small porch, a single bedroom, and a tiny kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, a scent I found comforting. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. There was no cell service, but the cabin had a landline for emergencies, though the owner had warned me it was temperamental at best. The second day started off peacefully. I woke to birdsong and sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. After breakfast, I went for a hike on one of the trails nearby, enjoying the crisp air and the way the trees seemed to close in around me. It was beautiful, but there was an unfamiliarity to the forest that kept me on edge. The trails weren't well marked, and I had to double back a couple of times to find my way. I told myself it was just the newness of the environment, nothing more. That evening, as I sat on the porch sipping tea, I noticed how quickly the light faded. The forest, so alive during the day, became eerily silent at dusk. The chirping of crickets and occasional rustle of leaves were the only sounds. The isolation that had seemed so inviting earlier now felt oppressive. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to city nerves, and went to bed early. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The door to the porch was slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. A draft could have done it, I reasoned, or perhaps I hadn't shut it properly. Still, I checked all the locks before heading out for another hike, this time sticking closer to the cabin. The air felt heavier that day, and the forest seemed quieter than before. The uneasy feeling from the morning lingered, but I pushed it aside. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. It was faint, like the snap of a twig, but in the stillness of the night, it seemed deafening. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear more. Another snap, then silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and forced myself to go back to sleep. The following day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. The unease from the night before hadn't left me, and I felt safer staying nearby. I spent the day reading and chopping wood for the fireplace. As the sun set, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows, double-checking each one before settling in for the night. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that the sounds and the open door were just coincidences, but the creeping feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I heard it again, the snapping of twigs, this time closer. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body on high alert. The sound was unmistakable now, deliberate and slow. My mind raced. Was it a bear? Person? I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. I shone the light into the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the thick forest. I saw nothing, but the sound stopped the moment I moved. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was watching. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with the fireplace roaring, the light and warmth my only comfort. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief. In the daylight, the fear seemed almost irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. That day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more thoroughly, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the noises. About 50 yards into the woods, I found what looked like an old campsite. There were remnants of a fire pit, some rusted cans, and a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It didn't look recent, but it was unsettling nonetheless. Who had camped here, and why so close to the cabin? The discovery only heightened my anxiety. I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself, but the unease was becoming unbearable. I debated leaving, but the thought of driving those winding roads in the dark was even more frightening. I decided to stick it out for one more night, reasoning that if anything else happened, I would leave first thing in the morning. That night, the sounds started earlier. I had barely settled into bed when I heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside the cabin. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. I crept to the window again, but the footsteps stopped as soon as I moved. I stood there, frozen, listening. The silence was deafening. Then, a new sound, a faint tapping, like fingers on glass. It was coming from the kitchen window. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The window was empty, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It felt like hours before it stopped. When it did, I bolted. I grabbed my keys, threw on my boots, and didn't bother packing anything. I ran to my car, adrenaline drowning out every other thought. As I fumbled with the keys, I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. My hands shook as I started the engine, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, the cabin disappearing into the darkness. I drove straight to the nearest town, where I found a motel and locked myself in the room. Only then did I allow myself to process what had happened. The next morning, I called the owner of the cabin to explain why I was leaving early. He sounded genuinely surprised and assured me no one should have been near the property. He promised to investigate, but I didn't care. I knew I wouldn't be going back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Was it just a cruel prank? A squatter? Something else entirely? I'll never know. All I know is that the sense of relief I felt when I left that cabin has stayed with me, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something I wasn't meant to understand. I've always loved spending time in the mountains. There's something about being far away from the noise and chaos of the city that clears my mind. Last year, I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the woods for a week of solitude. I'd been feeling burned out from work, and this seemed like the perfect way to recharge. The idea of no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and nothing but nature was appealing. I found a place online that was advertised as off the grid, but still cozy, with a wood stove, a stocked kitchen, and plenty of firewood. Sounded ideal. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The last stretch of road wasn't even paved, just a narrow dirt path that my car barely managed to navigate. As I pulled up to the cabin, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small but charming, with a sloped roof, a porch out front, and a stack of firewood neatly piled against one wall. Beyond it, dense trees stretched as far as I could see. There wasn't another house or structure in sight. Inside, the cabin was as advertised, simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove, a living area with a worn but inviting couch, and a wood-burning stove that radiated warmth. The bedroom had a single bed with a heavy quilt, and the bathroom had a composting toilet and a small shower. I unpacked my things, made myself a quick dinner, and settled in for the evening. As darkness fell, the isolation became more apparent. There were no distant hums of traffic, no planes overhead, just the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the crackle of the fire. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows and decided to spend the day exploring the area. There were no marked trails, but the cabin owner had left a hand-drawn map with a few points of interest marked. I packed some water and snacks and set out. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every twig snapping underfoot. I found a small stream about a mile from the cabin and sat there for a while, listening to the water and watching the sunlight dance on the surface. It was peaceful. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed something strange. The pile of firewood outside the cabin looked smaller than it had the day before. I was certain I hadn't used any yet, as the weather was mild enough that I hadn't needed a fire. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I just misjudged the size of the pile. Still, it left me feeling slightly uneasy. The next day, I decided to hike further, aiming to reach a rocky outcrop marked on the map. The hike was challenging but rewarding, offering a stunning view of the surrounding forest. I spent most of the day out there, only returning to the cabin as the sun began to dip below the horizon. When I got back, I noticed more firewood was missing. This time, I was sure. The pile had definitely been larger when I left that morning. My first thought was that maybe an animal had been dragging pieces away, but that didn't seem likely. The logs were too large for most animals to carry. I tried to shake off the unease and told myself I was overthinking things. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every small noise outside seemed amplified. The creak of the wooden walls settling, the occasional hoot of an owl, even the wind rustling through the trees. It all kept me on edge. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke suddenly in the early hours of the morning. My heart was racing and I didn't know why. It was still dark outside, and the cabin was silent except for the faint crackle of the dying fire in the stove. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sound that might explain why I'd woken up so abruptly. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and clearly made by someone wearing boots. My stomach dropped. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe a hunter or a hiker had passed by, but deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. Why would someone be wandering around my cabin in the middle of the night? I spent the day close to the cabin, too uneasy to venture far. I kept the door locked and found myself glancing out the windows every few minutes. The day passed slowly, the hours dragging by. As night fell, I decided to keep the lights off, hoping that whoever had been outside wouldn't realize I was still there. I sat in the dark, listening for any sound, my heart pounding at every creak and rustle. Around midnight, I heard it. Faint footsteps outside. They were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to know they were there. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped, but I didn't move. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was daylight, and the forest outside seemed almost peaceful again. But the footprints were back, more of them this time, crisscrossing around the cabin. Whoever it was had spent a lot of time outside during the night. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my bag without bothering to fold or organize. As I loaded my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The drive back down the dirt road was nerve-wracking. Every shadow, every movement in the corner of my eye made my pulse race. I didn't relax until I reached the main road and saw other cars for the first time in days. Looking back, I'm not sure what unnerved me more, The thought that someone had been watching me the whole time, or the fact that I never saw who it was. I've told myself it was probably just a hunter or a local curious about who was staying in the cabin. But part of me knows that's unlikely. Whoever it was didn't want to be seen, and that's what scares me the most. It all started when I decided to spend a weekend at an isolated cabin deep in the woods. I had been looking forward to some time alone, a chance to get away from the noise of the city and recharge. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine, and he had always told me it was the perfect place to disconnect. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just me, nature, and quiet. The drive there was uneventful but long. The paved roads gradually turned into gravel, and then into a narrow dirt path surrounded by thick trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy, built of dark wood with a sloping roof and a small porch. A single light above the door illuminated the area faintly. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. There were no distant hums of traffic or the chatter of neighbors, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. It was peaceful, but there was an edge to the silence that I couldn't quite place. Still, I shook off the unease, chalking it up to city life making me unaccustomed to real solitude. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small living room with a couch and a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a bedroom with a single bed. The walls were lined with wooden shelves holding books, old tools, and knickknacks. A single window in each room allowed in just enough light to give the place a warm, amber glow. I dropped my bag by the couch, unpacked some essentials, and set about making myself comfortable. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read a book by the dim light of an old lamp, and went to bed early. The bed creaked under my weight, and the cabin's wooden frame groaned softly as it adjusted to the cooling night air. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The next morning, I woke to a bright, clear day. Sunlight streamed through the window, and I decided to explore the area. There was a small trail leading away from the cabin, and I followed it, taking in the crisp air and the earthy scent of the woods. The trail wound through dense trees, occasionally opening up to small clearings filled with wildflowers or patches of moss-covered rocks. It was beautiful, and I felt the tension of city life begin to melt away. But as I walked, I started to notice odd things. A tree with deep claw marks running down its trunk. A patch of ground where the grass was flattened, as if something heavy had been lying there. Once, I came across a half-buried animal skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at me. I told myself it was all part of being in the wilderness. Nature could be harsh, and I was just unused to seeing it up close. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I was sweaty and tired, but the exercise had been good for me. I made myself a sandwich, sat on the porch, and watched the sun begin its descent. The peacefulness I had felt earlier returned, and I decided to stay up a little later that night to enjoy the quiet. As the evening wore on, the cabin began to feel different. The cozy warmth I had felt earlier gave way to a sense of isolation. The forest, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now loomed dark and impenetrable. I tried to shake off the feeling and went inside, locking the door behind me. The old wooden bolt slid into place with a satisfying clunk, but it didn't do much to ease my nerves. I spent the next few hours reading, trying to lose myself in the pages of an old paperback. But I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside, made me pause and listen. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. But when I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, there was nothing there. Just the empty clearing bathed in moonlight. I told myself I was imagining things. The isolation was playing tricks on my mind. I went to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child afraid of the dark. It took a long time for sleep to come, and when it did, it was restless. The next morning, I found something strange. The porch, which had been clear the night before, was covered in muddy footprints. They weren't mine. They were too large, and the spacing between them suggested something or someone had been walking around during the night. My stomach tightened as I stared at them. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but the shape of the prints was distinctly human. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I went back out on the trail, venturing farther this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would stop and look over my shoulder, but there was never anything there. Just the endless trees and the distant sounds of birds. When I got back to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it that morning, but now it hung open, swaying gently in the breeze. My heart raced as I stepped inside, clutching a heavy branch I had picked up outside. The cabin was empty, but something was off. My bag, which I had left by the couch, had been moved. The books on the shelf were slightly askew, and on the kitchen counter, a single muddy footprint stood out starkly against the wooden surface. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with a flashlight and the branch, jumping at every sound. The hours crawled by, and I began to regret coming here. What had seemed like a peaceful retreat now felt like a trap. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. As I loaded my bag into the car, I felt a surge of relief. I was getting out of here, but as I started the engine, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was tall and unmoving, watching me. I didn't wait to get a better look. I put the car in gear and sped down the dirt path, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I finally felt safe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That night, back in my apartment, I locked every door and window. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, that the footprints, the open door, the figure in the woods were just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching me. I haven't gone back to the cabin since. My friend offered to let me stay there again, but I made up an excuse. The thought of being out there alone, surrounded by those dark, silent woods, is too much. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. I tell myself it's nothing, but I always check, just in case. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. Life in the city had been suffocating lately, and I wanted a break. The cabin was in a remote area, about 2 hours' drive from the nearest town. It seemed perfect, isolated, peaceful, and surrounded by tall pines. The online listing had pictures of a cozy little cabin with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, and a porch overlooking a lake. It felt like the kind of place where I could finally breathe. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been uneventful, though the last stretch was on a narrow dirt road that wound through the forest. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. It was a simple structure, made of weathered wood, with a slanted roof and a stone chimney. The lake shimmered in the distance, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I unpacked my things, which didn't take long. Just a backpack with some clothes, a few groceries, and a book I'd been meaning to read. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The furniture was rustic, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. There was a single bed pushed against one wall, a small kitchen with an old stove and fridge, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. A stack of firewood was neatly piled beside it. The windows were large, letting in plenty of light, and the porch offered a view of the lake through the trees. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I took it all in. I spent the first evening settling in. I cooked a simple dinner, read a few chapters of my book, and then sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep purple, with stars beginning to appear. It was quiet, eerily so. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no airplanes overhead. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how loud your everyday life is. That night, I slept deeply. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the cool night air made the cabin feel like a cocoon. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds. I decided to spend the day exploring. I packed a small lunch and set off on one of the trails that started behind the cabin. The forest was dense, with towering trees and thick underbrush. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path, but I followed it anyway. I figured as long as I kept track of the direction I'd come from, I'd be fine. The hike was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I saw a deer in the distance, its ears twitching before it bounded away. A stream crossed the trail at one point, and I stopped to drink some water and eat my lunch. Felt good to be out here, away from everything. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. My legs were tired, but it was a good kind of tired. I built a fire in the wood stove and cooked dinner. As the light faded, I felt a deep sense of contentment. But that night, something changed. I woke up around midnight to a noise outside. It was faint, like something brushing against the cabin. I told myself it was probably just a branch swaying in the wind or an animal passing by. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay in bed, listening intently. The noise came again, a soft, deliberate sound, like someone or something moving around just outside. I got up and looked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. The forest was a wall of black beyond the small clearing around the cabin. I didn't have a flashlight, just the weak beam from my phone. I decided not to go outside. Instead, I double-checked that the doors were locked and went back to bed. Took a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were uneasy. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the clearing to the porch and then back into the woods. My first thought was that they belonged to a hiker or a hunter. But why would someone come so close to the cabin in the middle of the night and not knock or call out? The thought unsettled me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the sense of unease lingered. I spent the day sticking close to the cabin. I read my book, chopped some firewood, and went down to the lake to skip stones. The tranquility I'd felt before was gone, replaced by a low-level anxiety that I couldn't shake. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I found myself dreading the coming night. That evening, I locked the doors and windows before it was fully dark. I kept the wood stove burning and left a light on in the kitchen. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set my nerves on edge. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. Footsteps on the porch, a soft tapping on the window. My heart was pounding as I sat frozen in bed, listening. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the door handle rattled. I'd locked it, but the sound sent a jolt of fear through me. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy iron poker from beside the wood stove, and moved to the corner of the room, where I had a clear view of the door. The rattling continued, then stopped. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating, fading into the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner, clutching the poker, waiting for dawn. When morning came, I decided to leave. The sense of unease had grown into outright fear. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the car. Before I left, I walked around the cabin one last time. The footprints were back, more distinct this time, circling the cabin and leading off into the woods. Whoever it was had been watching me. The drive back to the city felt surreal. The forest that had seemed so peaceful now felt oppressive, the trees pressing in on either side of the road. When I finally reached the main highway, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Back in the city, the noise and chaos that had once felt overwhelming now felt comforting. Safe. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That someone walked around my cabin and scared me? There was no proof of anything, no crime committed. But the experience stayed with me. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night. The thought that someone had been out there, watching me, waiting, is something I can't quite shake. It's a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, you're never truly alone. I've always loved the idea of getting away from it all. The noise of the city, the constant buzz of work emails, and the endless cycle of responsibilities had been draining me. So, when my friend offered me the keys to his remote cabin in the woods for a week, I jumped at the opportunity. He told me it was a bit off the beaten path, but that was precisely what I needed: silence, solitude, and nature. The drive to the cabin took nearly 5 hours. The last hour was on a dirt road, winding through thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was late afternoon when I finally arrived. The cabin was small, weathered, and nestled between towering pine trees. It looked like something out of a postcard. There was a fire pit out front, a wooden porch with a rocking chair, and a view of a calm, glimmering lake just a short walk away. I felt a wave of relief as I unloaded my bags. This was going to be perfect. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent the afternoon unpacking, stacking firewood, and familiarizing myself with the cabin. Inside, it was cozy but sparse. A small kitchenette, a single bedroom, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. There was no TV, no internet, and barely any cell service. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over the lake. The colors reflected on the water were mesmerizing. As darkness fell, I realized just how isolated the cabin was. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or the rustling of leaves. It was both calming and unsettling. I'd never been this far from civilization before. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I hiked a few trails near the cabin, taking in the crisp air and the earthy scent of the woods. I came across animal tracks, deer, rabbits, and what I guessed might be a coyote, but saw no signs of people. The solitude was refreshing, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just my imagination. That evening, as I was chopping wood for the stove, I noticed something strange. On one of the trees near the edge of the clearing, there were deep gouges, as if something with claws had scraped the bark. They were too large to be from any animal I knew of in the area. I told myself it was likely an old mark, nothing to worry about. Still, I found myself glancing at the tree line more often as I worked. By the third day, the unease was harder to ignore. I'd woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the scampering of small animals. This was heavier, deliberate. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. In the morning, I found nothing unusual outside. No tracks, no signs of disturbance. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a bear passing through. That afternoon, I went down to the lake with the intention of fishing. The water was still and quiet, the surface like glass. I sat on the dock with my line in the water, enjoying the calm. After a while, I heard a splash further down the shore. Looking up, I saw ripples spreading out from the middle of the lake. It was too far to see clearly, but it looked like something large had broken the surface. I waited, watching, but whatever it was didn't appear again. The feeling of being watched returned that night. I'd brought a book to read, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside made me jump. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild. But when I stepped outside to grab more firewood, I saw it again. Those gouges on another tree, fresh this time. The bark was still damp around the edges of the marks. My stomach churned. Whatever had made those marks was still around. On the fourth day, I decided to hike further out, hoping to distract myself. The trails were rough and overgrown, but I enjoyed the challenge. About an hour in, I stumbled upon an old campsite. There were the remains of a fire pit, some rusted tin cans, and a torn, weathered tarp tangled in the bushes. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. As I poked around, I noticed something odd. Near the fire pit, there were more of those claw marks, this time on the ground, like something had been dragged. I felt a chill run down my spine and decided it was time to head back. That night, the sounds outside returned, louder this time. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circled the cabin. I sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, too scared to move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped at the porch. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found fresh tracks in the dirt outside the cabin. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, too large to be human, but not quite like any animal either. They were deep with long, claw-like impressions. My first instinct was to leave, but the thought of driving down that long, isolated road made me hesitate. What if whatever was out there followed me? Or worse, what if it was waiting on the road? I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day preparing. I barricaded the windows with furniture and kept the knife and a hatchet within arm's reach. As the sun set, I lit the stove and sat in the living room, waiting. The sounds started again around midnight. This time, they were more aggressive. The footsteps were faster, heavier. Something banged against the side of the cabin, hard enough to rattle the walls. I felt trapped like a cornered animal. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body tense. When the first light filtered through the trees, I cautiously stepped outside. The ground was torn up, the porch scratched and splintered. Whatever it was, it had been trying to get in. I didn't wait any longer. I threw my things into the car and left without looking back. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly cried. It's been weeks since I left the cabin, but the memories still haunt me. I've tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But deep down, I know it was something else, something I can't explain. I've decided not to tell my friend what happened. He loves that cabin and probably wouldn't believe me anyway. But I'll never go back. Some places are meant to be left alone. I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the forest. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and just immerse myself in nature. I booked a small, rustic cabin through a website that specialized in off-the-grid rentals. The photos showed a cozy wooden structure surrounded by dense trees, with a small stream running nearby. It looked perfect. I packed light: some clothes, basic food supplies, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a notebook. My phone barely had service as I got closer to the cabin, which was exactly what I wanted. The gravel road leading to the property was narrow and rough, with tall trees on either side creating a tunnel of green. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was even more isolated than I'd imagined. The cabin was small but charming. It had a single room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, candles, and jars of what looked like homemade preserves. There was no electricity, but a stack of firewood by the stove and a couple of kerosene lamps promised enough light and warmth. Outside, there was a small porch with a chair and a view of the forest. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my things, chopped some firewood, and walked around the area to familiarize myself with the surroundings. The forest was dense and quiet, except for the occasional chirping of birds or the rustle of leaves in the wind. The stream was just a short walk from the cabin, its clear water gurgling over smooth rocks. I spent the evening reading by the light of the kerosene lamp and went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the distant sound of the stream. On the second day, I woke up early and decided to explore further into the forest. I packed some snacks and water and marked my path with small pieces of cloth tied to tree branches, just in case. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The dense canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a dim, almost eerie atmosphere. I stumbled upon a small clearing where wildflowers grew in abundance. It was beautiful, but something about the silence felt unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling slightly foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. Back at the cabin, I tried to shake off the unease by focusing on practical tasks. I gathered more firewood, boiled some water from the stream, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, the forest seemed to close in around the cabin. The darkness was absolute, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up to what I thought were faint noises outside. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps. Each time, I told myself it was just an animal, but the sounds continued, growing louder and more deliberate. Around midnight, I finally got up and lit the kerosene lamp. I peered out the small window, but all I could see was darkness. My heart was pounding as I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The prints were human, leading from the edge of the forest to the porch and back again. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Someone had been here, walking around while I was asleep. I looked around for other signs of intrusion, but found nothing. The cabin door was locked, and nothing inside seemed disturbed. Still, the footprints were undeniable proof that I wasn't alone. I considered leaving that day, but decided against it. It was probably just a hiker who had stumbled upon the cabin by accident, I told myself. I didn't want to cut my trip short over something that might be harmless. To be safe, I spent the day closer to the cabin, keeping the hatchet within reach. I double-checked the door and windows before nightfall, making sure they were securely locked. That night, the sounds returned, louder and closer than before. There were footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circling the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard faint breathing just outside the window. I sat frozen on the bed, holding the flashlight and hatchet, too terrified to move. Hours passed before the sounds finally stopped. When dawn broke, I stepped outside to find more footprints, this time circling the entire cabin. Whoever it was had been toying with me. I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my bag without care. As I loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My hands trembled as I started the engine and backed out of the clearing. The drive back down the gravel road felt endless, the dense trees on either side pressing in like walls. I didn't stop until I reached a main road with other cars. Only then did I feel a semblance of safety. I reported the incident to the rental company and the local authorities, but there wasn't much they could do. The area was so remote that any footprints or evidence would have been long gone by the time they investigated. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I've thought about it countless times, trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just a local messing with me, or maybe someone had been living in the woods, unnoticed and unbothered until I arrived. Whatever the case, I haven't gone back to a remote cabin since. The idea of being alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, no longer feels peaceful. It feels like a trap, a place where no one can hear you scream,